Let's get ready to RPG!
RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG!
Hello, good evening. Welcome everyone to the Night's Last Call. My name is Derek Melinda, welcoming you to another live stream where we will continue to talk about RPGs until eventually the world dies and everyone goes away. We've been on quite the tear lately. We've been talking about a lot of RPGs and a lot of RPG topics, which no one cares about. And, you know, we love to see it. So we're back tonight with another scorcher. We're going to be talking eventually about metacurrencies in TTRPGs. And we'll kind of sort of probably go all over the place. But in theory, we have a tier list. All right. It's just a generic RPG tier list, but I put some stuff on there. Not all these games on this tier list will have metacurrencies because it's a generic one. So we may have to skip some of them. And I'm not familiar with every single game that uses metacurrency. So one part of this is going to just be talking about certain games' metacurrencies and how much I like them and how much I think that they do what they're supposed to do. But we'll also talk a little bit about the concept of metacurrency, right? And we'll talk about the pros and the cons. What do some people really like about metacurrencies? What do some people not like about metacurrencies? And how can they be used for good and used for evil? So hello and welcome, everyone. Mark says that the thumbnail reminds him of an economic textbook. Yes, we're back to exciting thumbnails. See, Pathfinder PhD says, good evening. Hello to you, sir. Dr. Waits, howdy. London is already 5. It's 7 here. Lance is here. Dan has an hour left of work. Sorry, Dan. You have to get caught up. Elia, welcome. Well, and Kalana. Nice to see you too. London. Karama says a nice super topical video because we could totally talk about the brand new Mythic Point metacurrency in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And we could talk about it. I will say that if there's a game that is not on the list and that you want to add it to the list, dropping a super chat or a tip is a great way to get your game on the list, and we'll try to at least talk about it or rate it. And even in the case of games that I may not know, again, this isn't some sort of be-all, end-all tier ranking of all time. It's just my gut opinion. If there is a game that I don't know the metacurrency component for, if someone wants to drop it and we can look it up real quick or they can explain it, and then I can at least give my sort of thought, even if I haven't had that much experience with it. Greetings, Siden, Doc Flamingo, hello. KC, what is up? Roman, howdy to you. Will Netters, hello there yourself. Heavy Metal Mystic, what is going on? You have to hear about luck and chivalry points in the VOD. All right, Rule of Cool. Well, go get your sleep. Yes, they never ruffle any feathers. Although in this case, right, we're talking about games that most people don't care about, so it'll be fine. What is up, Kyle? Hello, Ken. Beowulf needs some coffee. What's going on, Anthony? Again, feel free to throw your thoughts or comments into chat. I'll try to grab them as we go through them. And if you do want to eventually add a game that you want me to take a look at that may not be on our list, drop it in chat. Hopefully we can get to them all. But if you put it in a super chat or tip, we'll try to take care of it right away. But we also have 2 goals for the stream. A super chat goal is if we get to $50 super chats, we'll do a War of the Mortals stream, and we'll take a look at the book and kind of look at the new mythic rules for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, specifically the mythic rules. I mean, we could also look at some of the exemplar and the animist, but I'm really more interested in the mythic rules, to be honest with you. And additionally, we have a tip goal. If we reach that, we'll do a bonus Sunday stream, super Sunday secret system stream. So Karama, out the gates. Can we define what is and is not a metacurrency? Great. So, and I'll try to avoid going to the whiteboard for this. The simplest and easiest explanation is a metacurrency is something that does not exist diegetically in the fictional world of our game. A metacurrency is a resource that you can use to manipulate the narrative elements of a game. You can use it to manipulate the game elements of a game, but it does not really have any sort of place inside the game world itself. In other words, it is now, and by the way, there's going to be at least one example that sort of bucks this trend, but that's because that's what this system, in my personal opinion, is known for. Is a metacurrency exists outside of, right, the fiction, what we call the fiction, right, which is the sort of the fictional reality of our world. In most games, right, if our character is wearing armor, then we have a higher armor class, right? So the game mechanic of armor class goes up when we wear better armor. But that's because in the reality of the game, we are wearing armor. Metacurrencies exist outside of that fictional world, and instead are are super chats a metacurrency? That's a great question. Are they metacurrency? Yes, they are a metacurrency. Well, they're a real currency for a metacurrency. But what super chats allow you to do is spend your resources to have an outsized impact on the stream, right? The stream is supposed to just be the stream. But when you make a super chat, it can affect the stream. It can get your message highlighted. We can focus on your stream, on your question or on your topic. We can add stuff, and the stream itself will be shaped by your super chat. So in this case, you are spending currency to affect the stream, and so in that way, it is metacurrency. So. Dr. Waits, what Warhammer Fantasy 4th edition is on the list, and it does have 4 forms of metacurrency, and I agree with you. There's a lot of them, and they can be hard to keep straight. So Karama says, okay, so like how a PF2 PC doesn't have any concept of hero points. They just happen to be lucky or unlucky, as the case may be. That's right. People in the world of Pathfinder 2, right? People living in Golarion, doing their adventures, will never talk about hero points, right? That's not a concept that they really understand. Now, as I said, there are some games that sort of blur that line, and we can kind of talk about that. And Derek is kind of alluding to this here. What about something like willpower in World of Darkness games? It's a metacurrency. Is a metacurrency no longer a metacurrency if it has the flimsiest of diegetic meaning? My assertion is that, you know, it's still a metacurrency. And, you know, it's a gradient for sure. But for the most part, there are concepts and ideas that we use as metacurrency, even if there is some sort of relation back to the world. But to be clear, Derek, this is the sort of one of the main things that people can do with metacurrencies in order to sort of balance how simulationist heavy it is. As an example, sure, what is willpower? And like we understand, right, in a sort of a real world sense that people have willpower and they can use their willpower to accomplish great things. And, you know, in real life, we don't think about, you know, I would never say, oh, you know, Derek, he's got four willpower, you know, whereas like when we talk about strength, I can talk about how much you bench, or if we talk about endurance, we can talk about how long you can run or how high you can jump or what's your IQ score. It's a little bit more tricky to talk about someone's willpower. And while we understand conceptually the idea that willpower is a resource that you can gain and lose, it's a very, very, you know, sort of abstract concept. So, but that being said, there are metacurrency resources that at least sort of kind of barely make an attempt to link back to the, you know, the core game world. And for some people, that flimsiest of diegetic meaning is all it takes to say, okay, I'm okay with this. You know, this is fine. And I've seen people who really do not like metacurrencies be okay with them in instances where people put in the flimsiest amount of effort to try to make that happen. Doc Flamingo coming in with their member chat. Thank you, Doc Flamingo. for that. That's 7 months of joining the adventure. Appreciate you. I use a point-based divine favor in my game, which could be earned for character piety, badassery, and spent to affect in-game events. Does this count? My sense is yes, it is a metacurrency, but it really depends on how much it is tied to specifically earning and currying favor with that deity. I mean, you mentioned badassery. So do you mean like badassery in the service of the divine? Because in that respect, it becomes less of a metacurrency. If it's like some sort of, it may be a currency, but it may not be a metacurrency. If it's something that is related to how much you are, we are representing it with game mechanics. There's no doubt about that. But if my character is particularly pious, or my character is doing things that are in line with my deity's commandments, if I am smiting the enemies of my deity, if I am doing the things that my deity commands, and that is giving me some sort of resource or value that I can use that represent my god literally, or goddess bestowing divine favor onto me, while that is still a currency, and by some definitions a metacurrency, I would say it loses some of the meta-ness significantly, because it is something that people could talk about. Now, they may not talk about it as saying they have 4 divine favor, right? But it is the idea potentially in your world, I don't know how you set it up, is that someone could like look at someone, or there's a spell that you could cast, or there's some, commandment from the church that literally says this person has more divine favor than you. They have the blessings of their deity, and it shows up in the game world. They can accomplish miracles. They can cast spells that you can't cast because they have this divine favor. When it starts to get into that territory, it loses this idea of metacurrency. I know I went off on that for a little while there, but thank you. If a character can hold it, it's not a metacurrency, perhaps. Well, I mean, if you can hold it, it's definitely not a metacurrency. That's for definitely sure. Is Hackmaster on the list? I really like Honor and how it almost breaks the fourth wall inwards. We could talk about Hackmaster. Colin says, I've been told to make noise about drama tokens from Hillfolk, where players could compel each other to agree to things or resist those compels by giving or spending the metacurrency. This is very similar to strings from Monster Hearts, which we could also talk about if we want to. What's up, Cephalopod? Hello, hello. Callimachus, hello, hello. Yeah, and like everything in TTRPGs, right? It is a broad spectrum. And we haven't even talked there, in my mind. I mean, there's probably more than 2 axes. And again, I'm trying to avoid going to the whiteboard just because I don't even know where my whiteboard is. Oh, it's over there. In my mind, the sort of 2 axes of metacurrency, right, is one is this exists as a narrative metacurrency, and on the other side, it exists as sort of a game-based metacurrency. So one metacurrency kind of affects the narrative, and another metacurrency can affect the game, although, again, there's a spectrum, some things that do both. And then another axis would be how do you earn the metacurrency? Because as important as it is of what you can spend the metacurrency on, is also this question of how do you earn the metacurrency? And again, it's kind of a spectrum, but at the bottom, you have metacurrencies that are literally just given to you, right? The game just says, here you go, here's your metacurrency. You don't have to do anything. On the top of the list are metacurrencies that you can only earn by performing in a certain way, or taking certain actions, or doing certain things in the game to earn that currency. And again, that can really shape a game. And I find that axis, right, the one of how do you earn the metacurrency, is probably the single largest point of contention when it comes to metacurrencies, because of how people perceive, how it shifts the nature of the RPG and how it shifts the way that they're playing it. And some people really like it, and some people really hate it. And I found I don't know if it's 50-50, but it's pretty evenly split. Just see here. Let's see. So Ayla says, one thing I've always thought about regarding metacurrencies is what you are able to do with them depending on the game system. Some metacurrencies are limited scope, while others have reality-altering effects. Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, too, another axis, right, is how powerful are these metacurrency points? You know, what can you do with them, and how much of an impact can they have on the game? Because, to a certain extent, and again, avoiding too many tangents here, but we're here just to talk. I'm talking with you all, so if you have thoughts or comments, please throw it in chat. Right, I always talk about trying to respect. Now, I'm going to say something, and then I'm going to counteract myself. Right, there's this idea that the game, right? We're playing a role-playing game. That game has mechanics, and generally speaking, there is this idea that you are going to try to play the game well to a certain extent, right? You are going to try to build a character, even if that character is very simplistic, depending on the type of game you're playing, to accomplish things inside of the game, right? And the idea is that these character choices that you're making, whether it's through leveling up or building your character, or if it's through the things that you're doing in the game that, make and shape and affect your character, that is what matters for determining your success, whether or not you are successful. To a certain extent, metacurrencies sort of sabotage that a little bit, especially if they're very strong. So let's use the most simplest example, right? If I want to hit, say, an enemy in D&D, 5th edition, well, then the game's mechanics are set up in such a way that it says, well, you should try to have, let's say, in melee or something. You should have a high strength score. You should try to get your proficiency bonus up. You should try to get other bonuses from a bless spell or bardic inspiration die. You should try to get a magical item, right? That's going to increase your mathematical bonus, and thus you'll be able to roll higher and get a hit. So that's like the core mechanic of the game. But then there's this idea of inspiration, right? Which is sort of a vaguely diegetic, but it's really not. And also, too, inspiration can be earned very non-diegetically, which is very common in metacurrencies. Not every metacurrency, but, the classic example is someone tells a great joke. Not in character, just the player at your table tells a great joke. And you say, gain inspiration. So now they can spend inspiration to gain advantage, which mathematically is a huge bonus in the game. And so if a character, if you can imagine, almost always had inspiration, then the value of the mechanics of the game matter less, because that character doesn't need to have as high of a bonus, or they don't really care about your bless because they have this a way to shape the game's mechanics. And that means, and that's fine, but realize is that means that the mechanics of the game are starting to take a back seat. Now, inspiration isn't particularly well utilized or used, and a lot of people don't even use it. So I don't think that really does that to D&D. But metacurrencies can make it so that the mechanics of the game kind of become less relevant. Now, where that's interesting is if we look at a game like Mutants and Masterminds, which is a superhero RPG, and it has a very robust hero point mechanic, and it's got mechanics. But I argue, or I posit, and certainly the way I played the game, is that those hero points can, in some ways, basically make the way that you build your character kind of pointless, because the hero points are very powerful. But what that means then is that the game becomes less about building the cool superhero through the mechanics of the game and more about getting a lot of hero points. Because if a player at the table is able to accumulate a lot of hero points throughout the course of, say, a session, then at the end of the session, they are going to be very powerful. Not because they built a great character, using the point builders or whatever, but because they gained a lot of this metacurrency. So essentially, that metacurrency is kind of trivializing or making the game itself, the nuts and bolts, irrelevant. But I think that's a good thing in the context of Mutants and Masterminds. And the reason is because the way that you gain hero points is by sort of leaning into the tropes of comic book and superhero media. And that means that the players who are trying to beat the game are trying to beat the game with the meta currency. And that leads into a situation where they're encouraged to play a certain way. And the players who are good at the game are actually the players who have figured out a way to accumulate the most meta currency. And this, by the way, is where a lot of people get frustrated and they get irritated with metacurrencies, because now it feels like the game is not about the world or the game. It's about this meta concept. But if you're playing a superhero game, there's this idea that you want it to be about this meta concept. And the most classic example of this is, your character, your PC does not want, when Doc Ock is attacking the bank, and you're there to stop him, you don't want, as a PC, for Mary Jane to be, in line at the bank when it gets attacked, or Aunt May. But you, the player, do, because that's going to get you a hero point. And you need those hero points to be able to succeed at the end of the session, to be able to, finally beat the villain. So, the game becomes about accumulating those meta currencies. And that's where some people can really become irritated with the game, because it feels like now the game is not about the game. It's about this idea of our characters, external elements, and it can sort of wobble the veil of verisimilitude, which a lot of people are very much into. Let's see here. See, Colin says the best metacurrencies are given for player behavior, not player character behavior. So hero points for bringing food or giving a great speech or writing recaps. The players are like the Greek gods. So I don't disagree with Colin, but in that let me put it this way. We always talk about what gets rewarded gets repeated. And in most RPGs, we typically think of, XP as being something that you reward. Right? So I agree that if I want to encourage good player behavior, that metacurrencies can be a great way to do that, right? This player was a nice person, so, or they did something funny, or they improved the value of the game, so I'm going to reward them with this metacurrency. However, I do think that metacurrencies for player character behavior are far more impactful on the way that the game is played. And so while I absolutely love to encourage and reward people in that way, I also believe that there is a lot to be gained by rewarding behavior that player characters take through metacurrency accumulation. So while I do like giving people prizes, for being cool, I do think that the player character element is probably stronger. Nathaniel, just joining, so sorry if you covered this. Would you consider pushing rolls in year 0 a meta currency? No, not really, Nathaniel, because you can push as often as you want, assuming you fail. And there's this idea in the fiction of the game, right, that you are digging deep, right? You're gaining willpower, in Forbidden Lands at least, because you're testing yourself, and you're putting your equipment and your bodily health or your wits at risk by giving it your all. But more importantly than that, it's not really a currency. It's not something that you can run out of. It's not something you have to earn, and it's not something you have to spend. Interestingly, Nathaniel, I had a lot of problems. I love pushing. I like pushing your luck, but I did have a lot of problems with it in Forbidden Lands when I just ran my campaign. And I actually kind of wanted to swap it. Super tangent here, but in Forbidden Lands, if your character fails a roll, you can re-roll it. It's called pushing the roll. So you get to pick up all the numbers and roll them again. However, on the second roll, any ones on the D6 basically cause damage to your character, damage to your gear. But you can earn this resource called willpower. I thought that was a little strange. I kind of wanted to swap it, where willpower was a resource that your character gained some other way and would typically have more of it. And that in order to push a roll, your character had to spend willpower. So in that regard, willpower becomes a little bit more of a meta resource. Hey, Mish says, hi to the night. Your content is so great and high quality. Hey. I just subscribed to the channel. Welcome. And hopefully we'll have a Patreon subscription under the Christmas tree. Well, we look forward to having you join us. Hopefully you can get in and enjoy the conversations, maybe get into some games. There's a lot of cool options in there. We're a small community, but mighty. All right, what does Ith say here? Ith says, I wonder how common it is to have an economy which gets borked by the economy of what players earn, not scaling well with the rest of the world, leading to mega inflations of prices as players progress. Well, I think we're talking about real currency there, in which case it's very common in most games, although that's not really what we're talking about tonight. But yeah, it's, there's a big problem in D&D and Pathfinder where it's like, everybody else is dealing with silver pieces, and very quickly players are dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of gold pieces. And it just completely throws everything out of whack, PBTA games and similar have metacurrencies in the form of take +1 forward or similar, right? That is I would say that's more of a circumstantial bonus. I don't really necessarily view it because usually if you have +1 forward is not just some literal currency that you can spend, right? It usually says, like, for example, if you discern realities in Dungeon World, it will say, and take +1 forward if you act on this information, right? So it's this idea of like, oh, my character looked around, they spotted a weak spot in the enemy. So when I make my next, volley action or hack and slash action, I could take the +1 forward. It's still very diegetically connected to the things that I was doing most of the time. Let's see here. Beowulf says, I don't like Mother May I based metacurrencies. I like there to be a solidly established way to gain them. I think there's pros and cons to both of these. I do agree that having a more formalized metacurrency system can be very rewarding. However, I think that what makes TTRPGs is the game master. And there's a reason why we have a game master there. And I think that a game master has the ability to identify and shape and reward the kind of behavior that they want to do. That being said, my favorite forms of metacurrency almost always revolve around sort of kind of end of session or like communal decision making, right? Where we go around the table and we kind of say like, what do we think of this person's, performance, or even just, let the person sort of self administer and say, did I, live up to my belief this session? Okay, here's a persona point. And so I think that while it is nice to know what you need to do to get them, and I agree that there are certain game mechanics, inspiration from 5e D&D, hero points from Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where it feels just kind of wamby-pamby, kind of out there, and it's not really quite clear what you're supposed to be getting rewarded for or motivated for. But also Pathfinder 2 tells you should be rewarding about 1 an hour. So what does that mean? So if I give out 1 and then someone else does something awesome, should I not give out another one? And if I do give out another one, does that mean I really shouldn't give out a third one until at least next hour? And it's I think the hero point mechanic in Pathfinder 2 is garbage. I don't, spoiler alert, but, that being said, in that it's not very useful. It's vague what it does. It doesn't really encourage or change or motivate any behaviors. If you're going to have a metacurrency, I want it, right, to shape behavior. And you could do that through sticks and carrots, and we can, sort of talk about that. But, yeah. Let's see here. Yeah. So, on the spectrum of how do you earn metacurrency? I mean, clearly when we talk about fate, right, the compel from fate is sort of the poster child of the, I am bribing you. I am bribing you, the player, to perform a certain way that you would not otherwise perform. And in fact, in Fate, there's this idea of self-compelling, right? Where, it's you who suggests this way for your aspect to fuck you. And that's because you're trying to accumulate this metacurrency. But again, that means that the game becomes essentially about gaining fate, right? And spending fate, and gaining fate and spending fate. But the idea is that if you're doing that and you're worried about that and you're focused on that, the outcome of your game is going to be a really vibrant, feral story, which is what you actually want. And so, one of the things that you really have to ask is, what is this metacurrency doing? Does it serve its purpose? Is it creating the kind of play experience that we want to have, or that this game thinks it's going to have, right? So yeah. Self-confessed cynic. What's the line between metacurrencies and resources like mana? We covered this a little bit earlier, Vin, but basically, if it is something that people could talk about in character, that is, for me, most solidly not a metacurrency. And so while people in the game world may not, mana, let's say, is mana points, right? And while in the game world, they may not say, oh, I'm down to 20 mana out of 100, right? We have this gamist representation of that. But the idea that a character could share with the other characters in character, my mana resources are very low. I've almost been drained of all my magical reservoir. That is something you could talk about. It makes sense. People would understand that. They could be like, oh, we need to go visit this mana spring to recover your reservoir of magic. Again, something that you could actually deal with and gain and sort of interact with in the fiction of the game, right? AKA in the simulation of the game. And again, there's a spectrum. There are some metacurrencies which are pretty abstract and pretty soft. But there's also some metacurrencies that are, have a touch of diegeticness to them, right? Where they're just touching a little bit, just to kind of give people that tip of the hat to say, all right, it's not completely made up bullshit. So, and this is a classic sort of belief, and I'm totally okay with it. I generally prefer games with no metacurrency, or at least very limited scope metacurrencies. And this I have found to be true, where you have people who there's sort of like a progression, right? I don't like any metacurrencies. Great. Then slightly above that is I don't like metacurrencies, but if there are metacurrencies, number one, I don't want them to be something that punishes or rewards my behavior. And more importantly, I don't want it to be something that I can use to sort of change the fictional reality of our world, right? I don't want it to be like a magic wish where I can just be like, oh, actually, that's my cousin, right? They're more like, if it gives me, a reroll, or if it gives me a limited bonus, mathematically to some die roll or something, I'm okay with that. So that's like the people who are just barely, okay with a certain amount of metacurrency. So for me, well, actually that's not 100% true, but for me, like the one of the earliest metacurrencies that I used was technically Earth Dawn, but we'll get to that, but was in 3rd edition when we played Eberron. Okay. The 3rd edition Eberron book, and Eberron introduced this idea of action points, and action points were something that you gained when you leveled up. You gained a certain number of them. You got more of them as you got higher level. And it was a non-renewable resource. You didn't have to do anything to get them. It was use it or lose it. So if you didn't spend your action points during the level, when you leveled up to the next level, it reset to the new value. So it was use them or lose them. You didn't have to perform a certain way or do a certain way or use them a certain way. Action points let you roll a D6 or a D8 after you rolled your D20, okay, to bump up your die roll. Now, what was the intention of that, right? And obviously action points, because Eberron was supposed to be this kind of pulp action Indiana Jones, noir style game, right? So action points gave players sort of an ability to influence their die rolls after the fact, right? And it allowed you to turn, near misses into close hits. or or barely missed the save into a successful save. It provided a little bit of extra sweat, and that meant that your characters were more likely, one, to try silly or stupid or dangerous things that might be a little bit outside of their pay grade, and two, they were less likely overall to fail because you had a certain number of times per level that you could gain this bonus and turn a failure into a success. And that fit the tone of the game. It was making the characters more powerful in a certain limited way. However, it didn't affect any of the way that the players had to play. It didn't have to be earned. It didn't matter what the GM was rewarding. So in that way, while it was a meta currency and it may have shaped the way that people played, it was pretty limiting, right? In the sense that, and that might be a good thing for some people, in that it gave you a little bit more control, which is a fun thing to have as a player character. And it was random, so it was a little bit exciting, but it didn't ask you to sort of, play in a certain way. Are the hero points on the KLC cert a meta currency, or are they an anti-meta currency? I think they're just, now they're just nothing, but they used to be a currency because, you got rewarded for doing the thing that you wanted, and then you could spend them for creating good posts, which is what I want in the Discord. That's a real thing. And then, back in the day, you used to get, prizes and stuff for them. See here. Just kind of trying to catch up here. Amish says, when you reward something like hero points in D&D like TTRPG, how do you balance between giving sufficient currency to allow players to take some risks, but not enough to feel invincible and bored? That is a really tightrope to walk, I will say that if the players understand what it is, what they need to do in order to receive these rewards, and then they engage with that behavior and you give them their rewards, and then they spend those rewards to accomplish great things and feel invincible. In certain sense, then the mechanic is working as anticipated, because that's, you don't want to set up a situation where somebody does something awesome and you reward them, and then when they do something awesome again, you don't reward them, because then that can feel very arbitrary and it sends the wrong message. The whole point is to reward people for taking these actions. One of my biggest problems, honestly, with inspiration is, what if I have a player who has inspiration and then they do something cool, and I know I can give it to somebody else. Okay, fine. But for the most part, I like meta currency to be something that can build up. I like it to be a resource that a player can accumulate and use to good ends. So while, I think there's a concept of invincible and bored. Now, Mish, what I will say is your point is also kind of why, there's something to be said about games where the way that you gain the meta currency is by embracing the suck, right? In Fate, we would call this a compel, okay? In Torchbearer, it's using a trait against yourself. Because what ends up happening then is for a player to accumulate these kind of, powerful game-breaking currencies, they've had to, either things have to have been going very badly for them, or they have had to go out of their way to make things go badly for them. Either way, you're not going to end up in a situation where the characters are kicking ass, and now they get this bonus meta currency that allows them to kick ass even more. In kind of broadly speaking, for me, when you have a game that has meta currency that is given to players when things suck, or when they embrace trials and tribulations, and then they accumulate this resource, what you end up with is a gameplay pattern where you start where things seem to be going very badly for your character, right? You're losing, you're facing adversity. Everything seems to be going bad, but you're managing to pull through. And then as we get to the end of the session or the story arc or the adventure, when theoretically you've been doing nothing but losing for this entire period of time, in a sense, but suddenly at the end, you kick ass and you overcome, even though that should be theoretically where you're the weakest, right? Because you've been losing. So what does that behavior sound like? What does that arc sound like? It sounds like pretty much almost every movie or TV show or book that you've ever read, right? Very rarely, if ever, in fiction, do the characters, the protagonists, start off by just winning. In fact, most D&D campaigns or Pathfinder 2 campaigns actually have, in some ways, the worst possible likely outcome, right? Which is you go into the beginning of an adventure or whatever, you're fighting the relatively easy, trivial challenges, right? And you're expected to win, and you do win, and you win, and it's not really that big of a deal, and you win, and it's not really that big of a deal, and you win, and you win, and then you get to the very end, to the big boss, to the climatic encounter, which is also, paradoxically, where you are the most likely to fail and lose. And what do we call those, right? A lot of times we call those things like horror films, right? Or I don't know, feel bad films. Right, when you watch a movie where the characters, are kind of doomed to fail at the end, or they've come all this way and then lose, it feels very like depressing and downturning. And I think a lot of GMs, I prefer the term comedy. There's something to be said about that too. Yes. There's a quote where it says, drama, and I've used this before to explain to like Bob why I really like Lord of the Rings, and why I don't like anime. Drama is ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, right? And comedy is extraordinary people in ordinary circumstances. And drama to me is really cool, right? When you see ordinary people who have to rise up against these incredible odds. So that arc of most D&D characters is things are really easy and you win and you win and you win and you win. And then you get to the end and that's when maybe you lose, flip a coin, who knows? Here's your extreme encounter, good luck. And especially if you're playing in most D&D games where you have very little plot armor, narrative protection outside of GM fudging, which is why I think you see so many GMs fudge, because they intuitively feel like this doesn't feel right. How is it that the characters have been winning and winning and winning, and now they finally get to the end, and what's supposed to be their moment of triumph now is the time that they lost, is when they're losing? That feels backwards and wrong to us. When we watch movies and we read books, right, characters suffer losses and setbacks early on in the journey, and that only strengthens their resolve, right? It makes them, more determined. And, the reason the movie is continuing is because they keep suffering these setbacks. If they were succeeding, then the movie would be over. The book would be over. No. There's a ever escalating series of challenges. And then it's at the end when in some respects in the fiction, they're at their weakest. You know how many times you've watched a movie where it's like the character is beat up. Captain America's shield is ripped in half. He's gotten beat to shit. And that's when he's gonna kick ass and win and save the day. Right? That's not how RPGs work. You'd be like, no, I'm out of hit points and I'm out of spells, man. We're fucked. I can't do anything. Right? The game is not going to let me even compete in this space. So part of the reason that people use metacurrencies, because even in D&D and Pathfinder 2, I mean, most people use hero points to save themselves from dying. At least you should be. And the reason for that is because, we want the plot armor. So most metacurrencies exist in order to either provide your character with the plot armor needed so that you can tell a traditional narrative story arc in a game that is otherwise random, or it's designed so that you as a player don't have to feel like you're operating against your own best interests in the name of role playing. Now, for some people, that is why they like to role play. Why is your character acting like this? Well, because that's how my character would act. That's fair. And this is like, you're playing D&D and you're like, my character is angry, as like a personality trait. And so the players are, going in and they're going to go talk to somebody, and then you've had it up to here with the prince, he's insulted you long enough, and you say, I won't listen to you anymore, you're a coward and a liar, and your father should be ashamed of you. And everyone's like, oh dude, why'd you do that? They're gonna throw us in jail, they're gonna kill us, they're gonna do something. And you go, well, that's what my character would do. My character is angry. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but it can feel a little bit off-putting, because you're like, I understand that as a game, as a group, we are trying to accomplish certain things, and I'm just doing this because that's what my character would do. And historically, that has never really been a acceptable excuse for behaving in a certain way. But when you mechanicize those traits through metacurrency, it becomes more acceptable. And people understand that this is the game that you're playing. You're not playing D&D anymore. You're playing personality traits of the game. And the game is about those character arcs. The reason we're playing this game is because we, as a group, want to see us get into trouble because your character is an angry hothead. And that's what we're here for. When you're playing a game where you're like, what are you all here for? We're all here to beat the adventure, gain levels, gain treasure, and level up. When that's your primary goal, and then someone comes in and they're playing their character as this, angry, a temper tantrum, or temper prone character who gets you into trouble a lot or creates a lot of problems for you. Now it feels like, well, that's not what we signed up to do. So that's where also metacurrencies can be pretty, problematic. All right. I don't know. We'll go to the tier list at we'll go to tier list at 8 o'clock. So 15 more minutes of sort of expostulating on metacurrencies. Now, to be clear, I like metacurrencies, but I also understand the shape and the impact that they have on the game. There is absolutely no doubt, and I've said this before, and I will say this again. The greatest moment of role-playing games that has ever happened to me happened at the end of a 3.0 edition D&D campaign, where after an entire campaign of fearing this ultimate bad guy, the group's barbarian said, I'm not going to fight him. He's too powerful. I'm not going to lose my character at the end of the campaign. And in the final fight, he said, I'm out. And then when the party was struggling, he said, I'll fucking save you guys. Teleports back in, rolls a nat 20, rolls another nat 20 on his Vorpal sword, decapitates the super advanced Baylor demon prince, and wins the campaign. That had nothing to do with narrative metacurrency. In fact, the character, like the player who was leaving, was just doing it because he's like, it was not even in character, right? He's like, I don't want to lose my character. Like, it wasn't even like a player character reason. It was a player reason. So there you go. Final fight of the campaign. You have a 1 in 400 roll with this one specific character. And we always even joked it would be funny if he vorpaled. Rolled right there out in front of everybody. So that was the God's honest truth. And that was amazing. And there is no metacurrency in the world that could ever have created that kind of experience. But I also understand that was a 1 in 400 roll that one time. And am I, at this point in my life, maybe there was a time in my life when that happened, when that game happened, that adventure was played over the course of 2 days, a total of like 20 plus hours in 2 days time, right? A Friday and into a Saturday. So you were talking about like a 12-hour session or like a 10-hour session on Friday into like a 12 or 14-hour session the next day on Saturday. I don't have time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. So I want to have these great epic moments, and I love them. And I think that they're worth fighting for. But I also understand that they are far and few between. And I don't know how many campaigns I have left in me, before, that Nat 1 comes up. And while I really appreciate that and I love that, I also understand that sometimes when you let the dice decide, you don't have any sort of metacurrencies and it's just completely fortune-based, that it's not going to be epic and awesome. It's going to be lame and everyone's going to die and it's going to be like, okay, let's go again. I'm not in a place in my life where that is as appealing as it used to be. So, am I going to run 400 campaigns just so I can have that 1 in 400 moment? In a perfect world, yes. But alas, I do not exist in that world. I'm lucky if I get to play twice a month for 3 or 4 hours each time. So for me, metacurrencies allow me to get a admittedly less sweet, less potent, less truly vibrant narrative experience, but it's consistent and it's guaranteed. So while I think that a truly non-metacurrency game is probably the peak of the peak, the fact of the matter is, you gotta accept a lot of suck to get the good, and that's pretty tough. Let's see here. Sorry, there's a lot of chats here tonight. Thaddeus says, would checks in mouse guard count as a metacurrency? Yes, very much so, Thaddeus. Sorry, GM Scott, but I'm glad to see that you're here. Do I consider stress from Scum and Villainy to be a metacurrency since you can spend it to resist an outcome? Stress is absolutely a metacurrency, GM Scott. It is absolutely a metacurrency. Obviously, there's this idea in the fiction, right, of your character gaining stress. So there's somewhat of a diegetic concept to it, and we can cure stress by indulging our vices. So I do think that it stress occupies that sort of strange in between ground. That being said, stress is not something that, like, as a GM I can attack, right? Stress can be used to trigger flashbacks, right? Stress is used to gain +1 die or to help someone with +1 die. So what it does in the game is very metacurrency related, but it is unique in some certain ways because, number one, it is something that we can sort of visualize in the fiction, but most importantly, it is restored or resolved by taking an action in the fiction, notably indulging our vice. So that is a little bit of an unusual thing that sticks out about stress. But how it functions in the game is very much a metacurrency. Let's see. Beowulf says, fate aspects, fate points, and compel should be added to so many games. It's the perfect metacurrency. I think it's like the OG metacurrency. I can certainly respect that. That's right. I mean, if you've ever seen Die Hard, you know that broken glass only heals you. Except Cabin in the Woods, they fail, and it's awesome. Right, but Cabin in the Woods is a horror film, so to me, the whole idea of a horror film is the characters struggle and struggle and struggle, and then they still lose, right? To me, that is, sort of the default horror films, Yeah, they don't send Rudy in, right? He's been taking adversity the whole game, and instead of like spending in his narrative currency, right, to get Dan Devine to put him in, instead he just rides the bench and he doesn't get carried out. One of the greatest movies of all time, by the way. Who's the wild man now? Makes me cry every time. Rudy, Sam, it's a Sean Astin, right? Rudy, Sam, Sean Astin's got my number. It's bad. It's funny when it happens to you. It's bad when it happens to me. That's very true. So this is an interesting idea, right? When talking about metacurrency, is it's plot armor because your characters can't possibly succeed without it. It's like an excuse for balance in the game design. So I think there are certain places like that, like Pathfinder 2 says, like, we're going to create this robust system of mechanics, but realistically, we don't really want you to die, but we understand that these mechanics, because they're random, could generate a result that leads you to die. And we don't want that, but we also don't want to make it like impossible, because then it'll seem like, what kind of game is this that you can't die? And to be fair, there are games that do that, like Fabula Ultima, but they're like, but we don't want to be that kind of game, that kind of narrative game. So instead, we'll introduce these hero points that let you mystically stabilize and not die. And somehow that makes it okay. So I don't necessarily know that it's necessarily a weakness in the game design. I think it's more about the game being unwilling to talk about what the game is. And a lot of times it comes up like this. The game goes, we want to make our game seem like you can die, but really, we don't want you to die. You don't want to die. Your GM doesn't want you to die. Nobody here is benefited by you dying. But we're too cowardly to just go and, do the Fabula Ultima route and say, if you can't die. right? If you get to 0, you can choose to surrender every time. Your character will be fine, or you could choose to sacrifice and die and go out like on a blaze of glory. But a lot of these games they want that, but they know that their core base is so like they're just so like they're so unaware of what else is going on. They're not aware of what's going on in the game, right? They're so normative. And so that's what they want deep down inside, but they don't have the awareness to sort of be aware of it. And so the game has to kind of lie to them, and it kind of has to protect them from themselves. And so you get these games which are on the surface very deadly and very dangerous, but they're really not. And in fact, one of the things I determined kind of with Forbidden Lands is that Forbidden Lands itself isn't actually all that dangerous or deadly or difficult, but it feels like it is. And that means that you kind of get all of the benefit with none of the cost. But the cost is that if people figure that out, it can sort of remove the impact or the sting of the game. Oh, we have 74 people watching, huh? That was a while ago. I'm sure we've lost people now. Yes, it's 65 currently. All right. Now, let's go over to our tier list. All right. So here we go. So we got a bunch of games here at the bottom. Again, if you want to add a game to the list, go ahead and drop a super chat or a tip and, a couple bucks here or there. And we'll go ahead and add that to the list. I'll quickly find an image and we'll add it to the list. Now, again, this list includes games that do not have Metacurrency, so we won't be doing those ones. But let us start. And I just realized I don't even really have it here, so let me start with the great granddaddy of RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, because okay, sorry, I'm just moving some stuff around here, make it a little bit easier for me. Okay, so let's start with D&D. Now I know what you're saying. This is old school D&D. All right. S tier. By the way, this is the Metacurrency rating. This is not the RPG rating. Okay, this is the Metacurrency rating. So old school D&D, going back to the beginning, gets an S tier Metacurrency. What Metacurrency does D&D have? Well, it is the Metacurrency, right? The original Metacurrency. Hit points. Hit points are a Metacurrency. I don't know how to describe this to you, but they are. We like to pretend and we can try to kind of create this idea that, I could. No, it's a Metacurrency. In fact, hit points literally came from these games where, soldiers, it was how many times could you get hit? And fundamentally, we understand that if you're a human and you get hit with an axe, you're just dead. And so in these war games that they used to play, soldiers had 1 hit point, and maybe a great hero had 2 hit points or 3 hit points. Is that because they could take 3 sword thrusts to the chest? No. It's because it was a form of plot armor. It was a form of Metacurrency protection. And to be fair, hit points are more diegetic than some of the other currencies that we talked about. But by and large, they don't really make any sense because back in the day, they were like, well, this doesn't represent your character. Even the original D&D said, this doesn't represent your character having more meat and bones. It represents luck and divine favor. Okay, so then why did it heal at 1 hit point a day? Right. And in the modern day context, it's like, well, this is clearly you being damaged and hurt because, we can use treat wounds and cure light wounds and heal spells to magically restore your healing. And you're like, okay, so then how come if I get a full night's sleep, I'm at full hit points? What is going on, right? And GM Scott is absolutely right. Technically, your character in classic D&D, in almost every version of D&D, operates exactly as defined at 1 hit point as they do at 200 hit points. The rest of those hit points are just a way so that you can spend your metacurrency and say, I don't have to stop playing, right? I get to keep playing. My character has this kind of made up bullshit metacurrency that allows me to keep playing. It doesn't really make any sense. No game has ever really done a good job of trying to explain it. But why is it S tier? Because fuck it if it works, right? It works so well. If your character, think about D&D, if your character just died after getting hit once, the game would be very boring. And while that is kind of the way it is at first level for some D&D campaigns or some D&D old school systems, the fact of the matter is you're like, yeah, but then as I gain levels, I get more hit points. And so then I have more of this plot protection, And Derek says also S tier because most people are convinced it isn't a metacurrency. And to be fair, we talked about the spectrum of how diegetic a metacurrency is, from completely completely diegetic, like it is, or it is completely in the game, and that's very rare, by the way. Although I will talk about a game that does that, all the way over to this concept makes absolutely no sense. It is completely a fabrication of the fate points are a complete fabrication. There is no diegetic element to that. Primetime Adventures, the GM's metacurrency is called budget, because it's supposed to be like you're filming a TV show. And so the GM's, the director's currency is called a budget. But your characters don't know that they're in a TV show, right? But it's meant to emulate TV shows. Anyways. So 4E's bloody did kind of come in, but even then 4E was a little bit strange. You're like, okay, so I'm hurt, but it also doesn't technically do anything to me, but certain things trigger off of it. Again, hit points have always been in this really, really weird world. Elia likes wound tracks for this reason, and rightfully so, because I think for some people who have really, they've dialed into the RPG world, they understand, they start to feel like, oh wait, hit points are actually just a metacurrency, aren't they? Yeah, they kind of are. And, I know that Me, Myself, and Die's Broken Empires, which I think ends tomorrow or something, right? It uses that kind of RuneQuest BRP system of, hit location, and you take the wound to that location. And that is because this abstract bubble of hit points is a metacurrency. And so for some of these games, they have, tried to avoid that as well. That is true, Derek, but a lot of times these wound tracks do affect your character, right? So if my right arm gets hit with a sword and the armor absorbs some of the damage, and if it didn't, my arm might very well be destroyed. And even if my armor does absorb the damage, now that I have this wound on my arm, now I get a penalty to attacking. I get a penalty to fine detail work or whatever. If I get a penalty, if I take an arrow to the knee, I may have to retire from adventuring, that type of stuff. And we call these things death spirals, right? Because as you get hurt, you become more likely to get hurt again. And that totally makes sense, right? That's the way the real world works. But that's not the way movies work, right? And so a lot of times what people want out of their D&D game is they don't want real life. They want the movies. So they want to be able to take arrows and get hacked, get thrown across the floor by the ogre and be like, and I get up and I charge and I keep fighting, right? And that's what hit points allow us to do. So while it is a weird metacurrency to think about, it is in some ways the OG metacurrency. Okay. So I'm just going to go in kind of random orders. Again, if there's one that you want to see done, throw a super chat or a tip in there and I will get to it. All right. So, I'm going to talk about Earth Dawn. And I'm going to give Earth Dawn S tier. We haven't done our Earth Dawn stream yet. Okay. It is coming. Earth Dawn has 4 editions of the game. And the reason that I think Earth Dawn deserves this S tier, is because it is, to my knowledge, the most diegetic but fully, truly metacurrency effect that we have in this game or in this list. Now, I haven't played every single game, so I can't speak to every single game. All right. So Derek says, heck yeah, Earth Dawn. Legend points. No. Karma. So in Earth Dawn, your heroes, capital H, are not just ordinary people. They are special individuals that are called adepts, capital A, adepts. And adepts have the ability to use magic. So even in Earth Dawn, even a sword master or a warrior or a thief is magical. We'll get into this when we get into Earth Dawn. But the most important thing to sort of realize, and if you've seen The Matrix and you've read Wheel of Time, this will make a lot more sense to you. As your character, so Earth Dawn is all about this idea of patterns, right? The pattern of the world, the pattern of existence. And as the characters become more important to the world, as they accomplish stranger and more powerful and legendary things, okay, they essentially become like Taverin from Wheel of Time. And what Taverin in Wheel of Time, for those of you who don't know, Taverin are special individuals for whom the pattern of the world itself sort of is shaped around them in order to allow them to proceed. So in Earth Dawn, a character's karma is literally their ability in game. It's something that they can talk about. It's something that is existing in there, that they can essentially succeed where others would fail because they're special. All right. And because they have this, as they gain more legend, as they gain more of an importance to the world, they become more able to literally affect the fabric of reality. And that is represented by spending karma points. And so while it is a meta currency, karma lets you, and it's a pretty hard meta currency in the sense that it basically lets you add a die roll and add it to the result of a die roll. So, you can turn a lower number into a higher number, right? You can turn a higher number into a really high number. It doesn't let you like in some of these more modern narrative games where you can, oh, that's my cousin. It doesn't work that way. It totally could, but per the rules, it does not. But it is used to sort of represent your character's ability so that the world kind of works out for them. It's almost like, when we're playing our D&D game, right? We know our characters are special, right? But in the game world, they're not, right? They're just ordinary folks. Well, in Earth Dawn, you're playing your PCs and you're like, yeah, my PCs are special. Except in Earth Dawn, they are special. And so while this is a meta currency that essentially allows them to, just add dice rolls to add additional dice to dice rolls, it also is represented innately in the game, and people can talk about it. And it's a very interesting response to that, And Derek correctly identified that some races have D4, some have D10s. Amazes that you remember that, but yes. So Earth Dawn is something that has always stuck out to me, and actually. Earth Dawn was the first RPG I ever played that had essentially a meta currency. Earth Dawn came out in 1993. I don't think I got my copy till around 95, 96. I got it from Half Price Bookstore because I was in high school, so like 96, 97. And we played Earth Dawn for a couple of years here and there. And a couple different campaigns. And it was the first time, because at the time we had AD&D second edition, which had nothing resembling anything of a narrative currency. And I wasn't really playing World of Darkness games. So Earth Dawn for me was like my first sort of, take into this. All right. Where should we go next? All right. So I'm going to actually put this, can I add, is this going to let me add something here? Add row below. Oops. There we go. Okay, well, that didn't work. There we go. Okay. We got to delete this here. So, not a meta currency. Yeah. So I do want to, there's a couple of things that some people have sort of, don't understand, but like Dungeon World, for example, does not have a meta currency. In fact, in some ways, meta currencies are kind of an anathema, in my opinion, to most Dungeon World type things. Now, technically, Dungeon World has hit points, but by and large, and by the way, there are modern day RPGs like Avatar and Root, which kind of have a form of meta currency in the ability to sort of shape the narrative, called fatigue or injury or whatever, wounds, exhaustion. So it's a little bit diegetic, but by and large, Powered by the Apocalypse games work because you don't need the meta currency in order to create those narrative outcomes. The mechanics of the game themselves generate the interesting narrative outcomes that you're looking for. The only reason that we usually put meta currencies into a game is because we have a game which is essentially bad at creating fun, cool narrative outcomes that we all are expecting to see. Like, the game is not good at it. So we have to put on this meta currency system in order to make it so that the game actually allows for that type of play style. Well, Dungeon World and most Powered by the Apocalypse games don't need that because the mechanics are designed around that. Is bribing the GM with cold hard cash a meta currency? Like John says, that's just currency. I mean, technically, it is something that is outside of the fiction of the game. So in a way, that is a meta currency. Yes. All right. So let's see. So next, we're going to talk about what else we got here. I mean, we're going to bang out some of the S tiers. I'm actually going to put this is going to surprise a lot of people. I think for the game that it is, the best. Now, I'm not familiar with every game out there, and I'm not familiar with the earlier versions of this game. But in my opinion, the best meta currency that isn't full, complete narrative nonsense like Fate is actually Call of Cthulhu, 7th edition. Now, I'm not a Call of Cthulhu expert or master, but I don't even really necessarily like the game. But no, not sanity, Derek. Luck. Now, this is technically an optional rule in Call of Cthulhu, but I'm guessing most people use it. But it is so amazingly favorable and it works so amazingly well that it is perfect. Because what do we want metacurrencies to do? We want metacurrencies to enforce the kind of gameplay experience that we are all wanting to have. So, Call of Cthulhu is a D100 system. Your skill tells you what percent you are. Let's say you're 46% to do a check. You roll your D100. You have to roll equal to or under, right, the value. So, if you roll low, great. If you roll high, bad. Now, you have a stat called luck, and it is a great. Now, it is a game mechanic that represents an abstract concept that may or may not exist in real life. Right? In real life, we know luck doesn't exist per se, even if people are lucky. But it's a stat, and you can roll it occasionally. Right? Where, you're like, look, this doesn't really rely on any of your skills. It's just a question of, do you get lucky? Right? And it's a great way to gamify this. So in this sense, the stat of luck is already kind of a meta attribute, which is really, really cool. Scotty P. The first RPG I played with meta currency, not counting hit points, was Savage Worlds back in 2003. Coincidentally, the same year Fate 1.0 is released. Yeah, thanks, Scott. We'll talk about Savage Worlds next. We'll talk about Savage Worlds and Fate next. I think those are really good examples as well. So thank you so much for that. We'll talk about both of those. Thanks, Scott. So in Call of Cthulhu, you have this luck stat. So it's like, if you're like, I'm going to randomly, the bad guy disappeared, and you're like, I'm going to randomly pick a door to see, to go after him. And the GM can be like, okay, I'm going to roll your luck stat to see if you get lucky and pick the right door. So there's this idea that your character can be lucky. But what's so cool, it's right there on your sheet, it's big on your character sheet, is you can spend your luck in order to turn failures into successes. And it's so tempting in games when you're like, you know, you need to roll a 40 or lower, and you roll like a 43, you know, and you're like, oh, all I got to do, I'm just 3 points. Well, the game says, oh, you could spend those 3 points from your luck, and then it's a success. And the player's like, yeah, you know, I want to do that. Well, what's great is as that happens, your character becomes less and less lucky, and eventually you run out of luck. And what this creates is a process where we actually get the horror film kind of progression, where your character succeeds barely at the skin of their teeth, and then they succeed barely at the skin of their teeth. They're just managing to stay alive. They're they're barely succeeding. They keep getting advanced, and then only at the end does their luck fail them and they fall out. Because, you know, in the progression of a Call of Cthulhu campaign, the idea is your character is going to eventually run out of luck. And so not only is it very thematically appropriate, you know, my character is literally out of luck, and now the game rules are going to completely fuck me, and I'm probably going to end up dead. It's also great because it, in my mind, fully influences this idea of the horror genre. Not to mention the meta effect of that metacurrency, which is, as a player, again, I've never played Call of Cthulhu in any sort of lengthy campaign, only one shots at Gen Con and stuff. But I imagine that there's this kind of naive feeling of security and safety at the beginning of the campaign. You've got this luck pool that you feel like, oh, if something were to go really wrong, I could spend my luck. Or, you know, I've got a lot of agency and control over what's going to happen to me. But as the game goes on and that luck begins to dwindle, as you are forced to tap into your luck in order to avoid catastrophe or find the meagerest of successes, then that naive hope, right, begins to turn to despair and a sort of brutal cynicism. I'm not going to make it out of this, right? And that mounting tension of dread as you lose control. And suddenly you get to this point at some point in the campaign where you are essentially out of luck. And now your fate is entirely out of your control. It's just in the dice, and to a certain extent. And that when we're out of control like that, when we don't have control over, that's terrifying. That's horrifying. So it's kind of like the Jenga tower in Dread, which is one of my favorite games of all time, where not only is it a cool mechanic, but as the tower itself becomes taller and more unstable, you, the player, become, because that itself is scary, the game becomes scary. And it's the same thing with your luck mechanic. I think it's really elegant. I think it's done really, really well. And I'm a big fan of it. So Scott had super chatted us for Savage Worlds and for Fate. Okay, so let's talk about Savage Worlds. All right, so Savage Worlds is like one of the OG games that really sort of, brought, one of the earlier games that really started talking about metacurrency points. And in fact, going back to that time period, there was a time when a lot of people called hero points essentially bennies, because that is what they were called in Savage Worlds. And it sort of varies, but bennies in Savage Worlds, you start with 3. I think you start with 3 in each session, and you could be awarded bennies by role-playing your character well, being clever, doing something fun or heroic and entertaining, right? So it's very clearly on the rewarding, more of like the player behavior rather than the player character, right? So it is sort of a, kind of a more rewarding the player than it is. So it's kind of like more like hero points in that way, right? Someone's awesome, heroic, good role-playing, good idea, give them a benny. And it's not something that you start the game with a certain number of them, because the game wants to sort of encourage that kind of behavior. And what can you use them for? Well, you can basically re-roll, kind of like a hero point. You can use it to sort of absorb damage, kind of like avoiding death, kind of, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. You can use it to sort of recover from a condition or shake off a condition. And usually you can use it to sort of very minorly influence the narrative. Not majorly, but minorly. Now, for this reason, because it's mostly player focused, it basically just lets you, kind of kick ass and take name, basically bennies give your player, is you a player, the feeling of I can take some risks. I can, add a little bit of drama to the session, without it really costing me anything and without it really requiring, too much work on my part. So for that reason, I think Savage Worlds is a B. I think that they are effective. I like that, that they, give you these rerolls and stuff like that. And they do, Savage Worlds is supposed to be kind of pulp, sort of, pulp action, kind of, in your face, heroic type behavior. But for my Metacurrencies, I prefer them to have more of an impact on the feeling and the scope and the nature of the game. And so I'm not a huge fan. Am I the only one who despises the name Bennies? Urbane Blobfish, I despise the name Bennies. I'm not going to lie. It's stupid. I don't like it. I've never liked it. Now, what I do like is fate points. Now, fate points to me are sort of the original sort of modification of, to me, fate points are a metacurrency, but they're not even really a metacurrency because fate points are what the game is about, right? Fate does not function as a game system without fate points. So I put it at A tier, but realistically, while it is a metacurrency because it's not something that the players understand in the context of the fiction of the game, a lot of our other metacurrencies we've talked about are a structure that exists over a otherwise normal game. And I guess technically you could play Fate where you just roll your 4 dice fudge and, add your bonus. But Fate as a game engine is built around what I'll call the fate point economy. The whole idea of Fate is that your character is going to be sort of gaining and losing fate throughout the course of the game. And what this creates is a natural rising and falling tension. You as a player basically need fate in order to be able to succeed and do stuff in the game. That's what the game is based around. So if you want to be able to use your aspects in order to be able to actually accomplish goals in the game, you can't just rely on your dice rolls. You really require these fate points. And to be clear, I've had players, good players, fantastic players who I've played with. I've played Fate with them, and they struggled because the way that you acquire fate points is typically by having things go against your character. And in Fate, we call this compelling. And the idea is that you or the GM, or maybe even another player, looks at your character sheet and say, hey, isn't this a great point for your character to get angry and ruin this for us? And everybody kind of smiles and nods, and your character is supposed to kind of accept the bribe of the fate point and play into their character's angry state, which is going to create problems for you. So the tension starts to rise, but very brilliantly, as the tension is rising, that is meaning that your character or your characters are gaining fate points. So that means that as the tension rises, as the danger builds, your characters are now really well equipped to handle that new intense situation because you have the metacurrency that you need in order to be able to play the game. So you spend your fate points. And what happens? Your characters succeed a bunch. And now the tension starts to go down. You've resolved the tension, and we reach a low point where there's not a lot of tension. But your characters also don't have a lot of fate points now. So now we're back at another nadir. And this creates this sort of up and down flow that, managed well, can not only create ups and downs, but can create a gradual up and down rising tension as you move throughout a game session, as you move towards a conclusion, or even a character arc over a story arc over many sessions, where the stakes keep building and your character spends some fate, but they keep gaining more, but the tensions keep rising. And eventually you get to this end point where you're going to need to pull out all the stops and spend a ton of fate points, right? This is the Avengers at the end of the movie, right? Where they've gone through thick and thin, ups and downs, and now they have this bank of fate points, which allows them to sort of, win the game. And so there's some thoughts process to there, like saying like, that feels like cheating. But what they fail to understand, and when I've played with players who have struggled with this, what they fail to understand is that the game is not about what you think it is. The game is about this fate point economy. It's about the back and forth between it. So to give you another example, I have it on the list here, but if we look at Mutants and Masterminds, okay, a superhero RPG, Mutants and Masterminds has a hero point mechanic, and hero points are very powerful. They can let you re-roll a d20, but it's basically d10 plus 10, right? Like the minimum you can roll is an 11, so it's a good d20 re-roll. You can use a hero point to cancel out a negative status effect on your character. You can use a hero point to kind of create a somewhat narrative truth and be like, you're fighting a plant monster in a factory, a chemical, factory. And then, you haven't really established too many details. And a player pulls up a hero point and say, hey, we're fighting in this factory, right? What if there's some like chemicals nearby that's like a defoliant or some sort of like, Agent Orange or what is it called? Not Raid. What's the stuff you spray on weeds? Weed Be Gone or whatever. What if there's some sort of toxic chemical nearby? And it's like, and I'm like, yeah, there's totally a big pallet of barrels marked with, skulls on it. And it says like, lactic formaldehyde. I'm just making literally shit up. Everyone's laughing, lactic formaldehyde. And the player goes, awesome, cool. Now that that's true, I'm going to use my attack. And instead of attacking the big plant monster that's been immune to our attacks, I'm going to blow up those barrels and, spray it onto the character. Roundup is what I was going for. Yeah. Thank you, Kyle. And so Mutants and Masterminds creates this system. Now, when I used to play Mutants and Masterminds with my players, okay, at the end of a session, Smith would have a stack. We use poker chips. He would have a stack of poker chips like this high because Smith would lean in. His character was like he had a bunch of different characters over many campaigns, but his first campaign character was basically like a Superman type character. But, Smith would always be like, but what if they had, it wasn't kryptonite, we called it saltanium, but it's like, what if they had saltanium bullets? What if this villain's power core is kryptonite? And, like leaning into what if my girlfriend is in the bank? Smith would always go out of his way to look for these moments to build up hero points and look for problems for his character. Similarly, if Smith's character got hit really hard and got smashed through 3 brick walls and, slumps into an iron pipe and gains the stunned status for a round, that sucks. And you get a hero point for that. And Smith would be like, all right, you know what? This is like that scene in the movie where I'm out of this, I just got taken out for a round. I'll be back, next round. And I'm okay taking my lumps. I'm going to take my hero point. Other players I played with, like Matt Holloway, who played Burl in our Rise of the Runelords campaign, had a much harder time with this. They didn't look for opportunities to create problems for their character. They built their character to win. When Matt's character would get stunned, I would go to offer him a hero point, and he would say, just keep it. I'm going to use it to shake off the stun. So he would spend a hero point instead of gaining one because he didn't want to lose a round, because he didn't want to be out of the action. Because that, and again, in movies, we see this all the time, right? Where a character gets hit really hard and then, the camera and the shifts and the focus over to a different character for a little bit. But that's not the way that Matt wanted to play. And so what would happen at the end of the session, Smith would have a stack of hero points this tall and Matt would have a stack of hero points this tall or none at all. And now his character would really struggle, because now in the moment where your character is supposed to be kicking ass and taking names against the really powerful, strong bad guy, you need those hero points in order to get successes, and you don't have them. So, I think that, there's a pro and a con to this in a big way. That being said, I love Mutants and Masterminds hero points, and I think they are A tier. They're similar to Savage Worlds in the general application of them. However, I think the fact that they lean into the tropes of superherodom, that you should design your character to have these drawbacks or flaws that the GM can purposely attack in order to give your character hero points. Another thing is the GM can just, basically say, all right, the villain laughs maniacally as he launches several missiles at the bridge. the cable support snap, and you hear people begin screaming as a bus and several a school bus full of children and several cars begin to slide, perilously off the crumbling bridge. You'll never get me. Ha ha, next time. And I'll give everybody a hero point, and then I'll basically describe how the villain, Rocket jumps away and the bridge is collapsing. And everybody gets it. I'm basically saying, look, this is a scene where the villain gets away, and now you have to go deal with this additional challenge. Here's your hero point. Here's your bribe. And I'm doing this to cheat and to make the game more like a comic book movie. But I'm also not lying about cheating. I'm giving you this currency. And we found that this created it worked so well. And we had such a great time with it. But like in Fate, there were people who really struggled with this idea of taking the compel, you can see here, Alia says, I would struggle so hard with compel mechanics. And, like Matt, she might be in that situation where it's tough to not think about the game as real life. And what I mean by that is, I think there's a natural sense for people who are really embracing the actor stance, right? Where they are like, I'm trying to play as my character, and what I want and what my character want are kind of the same. Why would I ever want bad things to happen to me, right? I wouldn't. Why would I want something bad to happen to my player character? My player character doesn't want this. To be very clear, the problem with compels is that they create a dissonance between what's good for your character and what's good for the story. And when people have a very strong actor role, I think this causes them a great deal of upset. When you have a more authorial role, when you are looking at the game as a collaborative story building aspect, and your player character is just a tool that you are using in that storytelling experience, then I think compels become way more interesting for people. But when you are fully into this actor stance, and by the way, there's an element of actor stance, and author stance where you can become like, you could treat your character as a pawn, right? Where it's literally just a game piece. And quite honestly, I think in those situations, people like Matt, when he was playing Mutants and Masterminds, was treating his character like a pawn, was treating his character like a game piece. He wasn't like super in character, but he viewed his character very much as like, this is like my little guy in the board game. This is my little guy in the video game. Why would I want something bad to happen to me? I don't want something bad to happen to me. I want to win. I want to beat all the challenges, and I want to succeed. So GM Scott says, if I want to watch a movie, I'll watch a movie. I want to play a game. Well, what if the game is playing the game about making a movie, right? This might be a weird take, but I feel like the fate points effectively gamify the narrative in a way. Urbane about Bloodflesh, they absolutely do. They absolutely do. It changes the focus of the game from playing the game to I need to engage with these narrative elements in order to succeed. All right. Pathfinder 2. I'll give it a C tier. It's basic generic hero points. I don't think they're anything special. I think Pathfinder 2 particularly struggles with this because it's got this weird concept that people still struggle with it, where it's like, you're supposed to give out one an hour. What does that mean? Like, if everybody does something cool and awesome, shouldn't you award them a hero point? But if you award people too many hero points in Pathfinder 2nd edition, is that breaking the game? I think the hero points in Pathfinder 2 are so much of a crutch because they didn't want people to die. They gave you this out in the form of, of sneaking out and avoiding death in a system that really isn't supposed to kill you. And I just don't think it's a particularly great one. I'm not going to give it like a D tier. I don't even have a D tier here because I think it's, Neutromancer's out to go play Frosthaven. That's sick. I've not played Frosthaven. Me and Steven Glicker were going to start a Frosthaven game, but we never got around to it. But I've done 2.5 Gloomhaven campaigns, and I always thought it was really, really fun. Savas Craghart, R.I.P. That guy was awesome. So Pathfinder 2, not that great. So here's the funny thing. I like inspiration. I like it better than Pathfinder 2's hero points. But what was crazy to me is that when I sort of dipped my toe back into 5e with this channel, you know, when I started talking to more people about RPGs when I started this channel, I was shocked to discover that most people did not use, you know, bonds and flaws and all that other stuff. Because to me, 5e was like, wow, look at this, a D&D game that is saying, look, we are going to give you a metacurrency reward, inspiration, if you play your character to your bond or your ideal or whatever those other things are on your character sheet. I don't remember them all. And I actually thought it was pretty simple and easy, and you couldn't stack it up, which meant that it was use it or lose it. And while I do like people being able to build up the currency as a resource, I certainly respected this idea that, hey, it encourages you to, when you gain it, to use it. But apparently, I also don't have this problem in Final Fantasy games, like the Mega Elixir problems. A lot of people would get inspiration and never spend it because they didn't want to lose it, which is, you know, it's like, you know, you can't have your cake and eat it too, I guess. But I thought that the way it worked, and if I recall correctly, you can give your inspiration to another player if it made sense in the fiction. I thought that was really great. Like if my character had inspiration and like I sort of give like a, you know, heartfelt, you know, speech to my fellow player character, I can give them my inspiration. I could be wrong about this, so please tell me in chat if I'm wrong about this. But I actually thought this was D&D. It was still D&D. It was never going to be a narrative game. But I actually thought they were trying to create something here that would, you know, kind of mechanically incentivize certain elements of role-playing and actually add a little bit of true role-playing to D&D. But apparently it failed utterly because people, by and large, didn't use it and hated it. So go figure. Yeah, I agree. Actually, I do agree with you that they do feel out of place in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. That metacurrency, it is a weird, you know, rate. In fact, you know what? I lied. Hold on a sec here. I am going to make a D tier. Because I do think Pathfinder 2nd Edition is D tier. I just don't think it's very good. I just, you know, I don't think the game needs it, quite frankly. That's what it really comes down to. And I don't really know what it's adding to the game. And I don't think it's adding. And it's very confusing how you're supposed to award them. And if you award too many, is it breaking the game and yada, yada, yada. All right. Let's see here. Jasari says they definitely were trying to expand on role-playing with 5e inspiration, but because of the crunch and just not being common, they didn't get used or forgotten about. Yeah, it's so strange because it does take up such a huge part of the character sheet. And it's so funny because for Smith and I, this was like one of the things that we were like, kind of like, oh, okay, wow, 5e is bringing something new to the D&D table. And we were kind of just really surprised by that. All right, let's talk about Fabula Ultima. Fabula Ultima, I think Fabula Ultima is S tier because Fabula Ultima in some ways is a fantastic example of how you can use metacurrency points to not only push the game forward, but to really drive home what the game is about. So Fabula Ultima, in my mind, combines some of the best elements of some of these other systems and puts it into one. So in Fabula Ultima, number one, you get Fabula points when your character critically fumbles. Doesn't happen that often, but it's a great, again, these are all serving very good purposes. When you roll critical fumble, it sucks, right? The GM gets an opportunity, which is sort of like the GM's ability to sort of make a GM move, sort of. It sucks, but cool, you get a Fabula point. So it lessens the sting, right? Which I think is really, really important. Like, imagine, to use another example, going back to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. A lot of us are more familiar with Pathfinder 2nd Edition. A lot of people know that if your character is stunned or like slowed to or, you know, knocked unconscious and you miss your round of combat, right? It sucks. It's pretty crappy. But imagine if when your character got, you know, taken out or unconscious or stunned and you missed a round of combat, what if like every round that you were stunned, you gained a hero point? you know, or if every time you became stunned, you gained a hero point. Suddenly you're like, okay, this sucks. I am out of the action, but at least I got something for it. And that's pretty cool. So first things Fabula points do is they make you feel better about something bad happened to you. So that's the first thing. Second thing, if your character gets reduced to 0 hit points and you choose to surrender, that means your character doesn't die. So you choosing not to die awards you 2 Fabula points. The game basically says, this really sucks. Your character is going to, you know, be out of the action maybe for a little bit. You know, you going down into 0 is a big deal. There's going to be narrative consequences. You went down, but you know what? Here's 2 Fabula points. When you do come back, and you will, because you're guaranteed to, you're going to have more ability to get stuff done. And that's going to be a huge win. So again, not only is it, number one, making a bad thing, you know, less bad, but it's also kind of quietly, silently bribing the player to choose to surrender, right? And I think that's really important. The third way that you gain Fabula points is the GM introducing villains into the adventure. So again, something bad happening to you, but it's good for the story. Villains need to show up. So if the GM has a villain arrive on the scene, or maybe the GM does a cut scene, right? A sudden flash to the villain's secret lair, and they, you know, you get to see a brief sneak preview of what awaits you in the final boss room. Cool. That's me sort of being a director and managing the game, but I'm also sort of setting up the stakes, and I'm sort of setting up the villains, and the villains are going to show up. Great. We get Fabula points. So in the way that you gain Fabula points isn't quite so heavy-handed in Fabula Ultima as it is in Fate and Mutants and Masterminds. Fabula points don't ask your character to, you know, do something stupid in order to gain a Fabula point, right? They basically say, hey, look, you're going to play the game, and sometimes bad stuff's going to happen to you, some of which the GM is going to be sort of responsible for, but you're going to get compensated for that. You're going to get rewarded for that. So when the bad stuff does happen to you, it's okay. But it's not like the kind of like heavy-handed, compelling that you see with Fate and Mutants and Masterminds. And I think that makes it more appealing to certain people. We had a big super chat from our friend Karima. It says, running all these arenas in Southern Beaches, it's funny how often the players get an extra hero point and then they all blow those points missing more instead of saving something to try to not die later. And Karima, I mean, we've said this on this channel forever, which is if you have 2 or 3 or 4 hero points, feel free to spend them. You know, do that reroll. But if you're down to your last hero point, you should almost never spend it. Because when you have just 1 hero point, because if you have 3 hero points and your character is about to die, you have to cash all of them in. So you're losing out on 3 hero points. So the best option, honestly, is to keep your hero points at 1. And you start the session at 1, so don't spend that. But if you get awarded another one and you're at 2 or you're at 3, spend it. You know, maybe not on the map -10 attack, but spend it if you have a big attack, a power attack, an important spell, it's your first attack of the turn, re-roll that. That's fine. If there's a save you should have passed or whatever, maybe you roll an @1, right? That's probably acceptable to re-roll. But I think it is very common for players to be in situations where, you know, they miss and they spend a hero point to re-roll. And it's like, no, you were immortal. What are you doing? Don't spend all your hero points. You know, it's crazy. So yeah, I'm right there with you, Karima. And again, Karima, I have seen it happen in my own tables with very smart players, you know, people who are very aware of what's going on. And they'll be like, you know, just some random monster. It's round 2 or 3. Their players are almost certainly going to win. And the player, you know, they start their turn off and they have to move and they have to move and they have 1 action left and they attack and they roll like a 2 or 3. And I go, that misses. And the player goes, and spends their last hero point to re-roll it. It's like crazy. The only time that might be even remotely acceptable is like if you're right at the end of the session and you know that at the start of the next session, you're going to get a new hero point. And that's metagaming the Metacurrency. So I at least respect that. So Fabula points, really, really great. The other thing that I really like about Fabula Ultima is it has GM narrative currency. Ultima points. And I know not everybody loves these, but I think it is a cool way for players to feel less bad about the GM cheating very openly. Very clearly, villains have a pool of Ultima points. And number 1, whenever they spend Ultima points, which is a bad thing, the GM gets to, basically get a lot of superpowers. And the GM can even spend Ultima points to basically the villain gets away. But the players get Fabula points. So the players are excited because they're getting this currency. But that villain can never regain those Ultima points. So the players understand, like I've played Mutants and Masterminds before, and sometimes, the villain gets away and they could spend hero points. But the players knew that I could theoretically do that forever. And I could just keep having the villain get away if I wanted to and giving them hero points. But in Fabula Ultima, that is not the case. Now, there's the whole escalating villain thing, but let's ignore that for a moment. Because even then, that's still building towards an ultimate conclusion. If you're fighting a villain, you know that this villain has 10 Ultima points, and you've tangled with him several times, and he's gotten your number a couple of times spending Ultima points, and you've gotten his number a couple of times, and he's had to spend a bunch of Ultima points to get out, and he's down to 2. So it creates this sense of we're building on taking him out. Like, you understand that you will never be able to take out that villain the first time you fight him. She's got 10 Ultima points. She can just get away. But eventually, after encountering that villain a couple of times, you've worn down the Ultima points, and now the villain has run out of their plot armor. And it's very open, and it's very aware. The players know what's going on, and that is what's so awesome. Now, not to keep going on about Fabula Ultima, but what's really cool about Fabula Ultima, and by the way, spoiler alert, Torchbearer does as well, Burning Wheel as well. What's great about Fabula Ultima is going back to the reward balance cycle. So the GM is cheating with their villains, but the GM is sort of, fudging with their villains. They're introducing villains. You're rolling bad. You're getting taken out. You're building up all these Fabula points. Great. Well, Fabula points are going to let you re-roll and gain big bonuses by tapping into your character's identity and theme and your bonds with your fellow players or the world. So it's all very tied to the role-playing and to the narrative, which is great. But spending those Fabula points is how your character gets experience points. And by and large, this is how we want to level up. Part of the problem that Fate and Mutants and Masterminds have is that, or inspiration or hero points, it is a form of rewarding the players, but the ultimate reward is always going to be experience points. And so what Fabula Ultima does so well is it's a double reward for the players because they want to spend them. I'm sure there are players who do hoard them, but my players, when we've played Fabula Ultima, have spent them almost as quickly as they come in. Number one, because they understand that it is a constant flow. But number two, they understand I got to spend these things to level up, and I want to level up. So it's a way of letting the players feel like not only am I getting these, does it feel like a reward, but then when I spend them, I feel like a reward is given to me. Because a lot of times the problem with these systems is people get these hero points and they're afraid to spend them. They sit on them, they bank them, waiting for some rainy day. But Fabula Ultima kind of punishes you to do that because it says if you don't spend your Fabula points, you guys aren't going to get experience points. So it's really cool that it encourages not only the way that you gain them, but it's also the way that you spend them. And that means that players are going to be, again, gaining them naturally throughout the course of the game, but not doing it in the sort of super heavy-handed way that Fate compels and Mutants and Masterminds sort of GM fudging says, oh, your character is going to do this stupid thing, right? You're going to do this stupid thing? Okay, here's the point. That's not the case in Fabula Ultima. But through the course of playing the game and having villains do their villainous stuff, you're going to gain these Fabula points. And then when you spend them, you're going to be awesome and kick ass. And instead of feeling bad, like, oh, I had all these cool Fabula points, and now I don't have them because I spent them. You're like, yeah, but I gained a bunch of experience points, so I feel great because I'm going to get that level. So Fabula points are awesome to me. And they also let you, kind of tweak the narrative a little bit, which is something I always appreciate in a narrative style game. So Fabula points are awesome to me. So with that in mind, let's see here. Let's talk about Legend of the Five Rings. The meta currency of Legend of the Five Rings is not great. I think it needs to be better. Legend of the Five Rings uses void points as its meta currency. You gain void points more or less when your disadvantages come up against you and make you fail. So this is, again, a way of sort of making you feel less bad about the bad stuff that happens to you, which is great, which I think is fine. And it's, I'm not saying it's diegetic because, the void is something that people talk about. But the idea is that, like, as your character faces adversity, as your character faces their anxieties, right, they gain this sort of spiritual enlightenment. So there's a little bit of a diegetic touch there. I don't mind that per se. What I don't like about void points is that it is, per the rules as written, what they do is not that great. A void point lets you add a single D6 to a dice roll, and you have to roll it before you make the roll. And a lot of times you don't know that you need it until after you roll the dice. You can only spend one at a time. It feels like a very minor thing, and it doesn't really feel like it encourages a certain type of behavior, and it doesn't really feel like it's all that rewarding. It's okay because it does somewhat, kind of tie into your character's personality traits, which is a nice, cool thing. But all in all, it's really not that great. So I'm not a big fan of it, really. It's actually one of the weaker, for me, it's one of the weaker parts of the system. One that I would definitely want to change or sort of modify as we go through. Let's see, what else we got here? Okay, Torchbearer. Torchbearer, I'm going to put... Ooh, that's a great question. So I'm going to put Torchbearer again here. Because Torchbearer is, I don't know, it may have it has some elements of Fate and Fabula Ultima, but ultimately I do feel like it is more here. So in Torchbearer, you actually have 2 metacurrencies, which, arguably could maybe, knock it down to B tier just because it becomes more confusing. You have 2 metacurrencies, Fate points and persona points. The most important thing about them is, like Fabula Ultima, in Torchbearer, you don't gain experience points. But in Torchbearer, in order to level up, in order to get to level 2, in order to get to level 3, you have to have spent, not just gained, but spent. So you can, again, Torchbearer preceded Fabula Ultima. Let me be very clear about that. But you can definitely see where maybe, Emmanuel was sort of inspired by this. You have to have spent a certain amount of Fate points and a certain amount of persona points. Okay. So in other words, you needed to have obtained both metacurrencies and then spent them in order to level up. Now, spending the metacurrency is obviously, gives you some sort of, cool advantage. You can spend your persona points to tap into your nature and have a really powerful roll. You can spend Fate points to take any 6s that you rolled in your dice pool and make them explode, right? So Fate points and persona points are both useful for making you more effective. But the way that you acquire Fate and persona points is not done during the session. It's done after the session. There's sort of a questionnaire. And ultimately, Torchbearer and Burning Wheel and Mouseguard are really more about asking about your character. Like, what does your character believe in? What is your character trying to accomplish? And did they do those things? And so at the end of a session of Torchbearer, you are going to look at the questions about your belief, about your goal, and about your instinct. And what's cool about this game is that, and I'm just using this as one example. So your character has a belief, that is sort of intrinsic to your character's identity. And at the end of the session, there's a question. You can earn a Fate point if you act on your belief. If you take action in the service of your character's beliefs during the session, you earn 1 Fate point. You do this at the end of the session. It's sort of a questionnaire. We kind of talk it over amongst us as a group. You can get this award once per session. So that means that in order to earn Fate points, we need to act on our belief. Now remember, in order to level up, we need to earn Fate points and then spend them. But we also need to earn persona points and then spend those. Now, there's other ways to earn Fate, but I'm specifically focusing on this one particular area. How do we earn persona points? Well, to earn a persona point, one of the things that you can do is act against your belief. Okay? This is a difficult one. It's hard to quantify, but if you play against your belief in dramatic fashion, if you make a decision in the game that's counter to what you believe, and you let everyone know about the inner struggle through the performance of your character, you earn a persona point. You cannot earn this reward and the acting on your belief reward in the same session. It's one or the other. And what this means, from a super meta perspective, is that in order for you to advance in Torchbearer, your character has to both play their beliefs and occasionally play against their belief. You need to make your character have this sort of, sticking to their guns and also struggling with their choices. All right. And you can't earn them both in the same session. So it's going to take many sessions for these things to accumulate. And there's other ways that you can earn fate and persona. But as an example, when it comes to like goals, if your character accomplishes a goal in a session, they earn a persona point. But if they don't accomplish their goal, but they make good progress towards their goal, then they earn a fate point. But what that means is if you only choose goals for your character that are very easily achievable, you will always achieve them and you will earn persona points, but you won't earn any fate points. The only way that you will earn fate points is if you set up a goal that is difficult enough that you can work towards it in a session, but not accomplish it in a session. And so there's sort of a metagaming aspect to this, right? Where you occasionally are going to be shifting your character's goals and sometimes even your beliefs in order to sort of, figure out a way to level up. But what it means is that Torchbearer, while ostensibly an old school D&D dungeon crawler, okay, is actually a game about these character arcs and what does your character believe in and what do they fight for? And this is very much taken from Burning Wheel and from Torchbearer or Mouse Guard. So I think it's really, really cool. Now, Torchbearer technically has a third type of metacurrency called checks. We're not going to get into that, but that is a hard metacurrency. Basically, your character can only camp, right? Like you're going into the dungeon, you get a little beat up, you want to go camp. You can't camp unless your party has accumulated checks. Okay? How do you accumulate checks? By using your traits and actions against yourself, right? By taking a successful roll and turning it into a failure roll, right? And so the game is basically encouraging you to sort of lose in order to earn checks. Now, you don't have to earn checks. You could never camp if you don't want to, but then the game will become really hard. So in other words, the skill of the game is figuring out what checks can I afford to lose, what checks can I not afford to lose, what plays to my character, what plays to the overall strategy of the game. So it is still in the box. Ayla, it's still in the box. What's up, Boothby? Persona. All right. We got a couple more minutes left, so we'll do a couple more here. So I'm going to put Burning Wheel. I'm actually going to put Burning Wheel below Torchbearer because Burning Wheel is even more complicated, and it's got Artha, and it's got a bunch of other stuff that I don't really fully understand myself. Okay. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has 4 metacurrencies. It has Fate and Fortune, Resolve, and Resilience. And I think it's interesting, and I think it's cool. It's a lot of metacurrencies to sort of deal with at once, and it can probably get very confusing. Some of them are essentially one-time resources that do not recover over the course of the campaign, and others are more of a use it and regain it from session to session. I don't dislike that. I actually kind of think that's kind of interesting. But Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay does kind of strike me. In fact, I was surprised when we did the first look for this because I didn't expect this game to have that kind of plot armor. And let's again remember, metacurrencies are usually a way to enforce a narrative or game idea. And the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game is supposed to be this grim, dark, everybody's gritty and dying and brutal. But you get these Fate and Fortune, Resolve, and Resilience, which give you a lot of plot armor. In fact, one of them, I don't remember one, I think Fate points. When your character gets killed, basically, you can spend a Fate point and you're not killed. And so it's kind of like Fabula Ultima in that way, except it technically has a limit, right? How many Fate points you have. So there's only so many get out of jail free cards. So it's kind of like Call of Cthulhu in that way. But I was just surprised to see it in that game. And I don't know that it's weird for me to have a game that is supposed to be like simulationist heavy, but then has this really pretty heavy-handed narrative metacurrency. That being said, I do like the idea of multiple resource tracks. I do like the idea of these long-term resource tracks, kind of like Call of Cthulhu or Fate and Resolve or whatever from Warhammer Fantasy, that don't come back or come back very slowly. It's a very limited resource versus a more tactical resource. So you can think of it as like having a strategic metacurrency and then a tactical metacurrency. I do like that. So I do like that about that game. Okay. Morkborg actually has a metacurrency. I don't really know that much about metacurrencies, but I do know that Morkborg has one, which is that it is I think it's technically an optional rule, but it's called like prophecy or omens. Basically, your character gets a limited number of rerolls per session, or per day. I think it's per day. So it's use it or lose it, which I like. You can use it to max out a damage roll, which I think is cool. But it doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't really push the game in any sort of exciting direction. It's one of those more of like those, do you want to use it to save your character's ass, or do you want to use it to, do a lot of damage and turn a miss into a hit, is mostly what it comes down to. So it's not particularly relevant, and I don't really know why it's in the game, but it sounds like it's effective in certain ways. And the fact that you get it on a per day basis, I think is really interesting. Again, I'm not a super Morkborg expert, so somebody could correct me here if I'm wrong. I'm off to play Kane. I think you mean Karn. We'll catch the rest of the rankings in the VOD. All right. So, speaking of Ars Magica, let's see here. I'm trying to think of what metacurrency Ars Magica has. I mean, there's whatever, it's vis, like your magical energy. But I feel like that's pretty diegetic, right? I mean, it's solidified magic, right? I mean, it's literally the magical essence of the game. So I don't know if Ars Magica has Thaddeus. I don't know if you're still here, but let me know what you think, because I don't know. Okay. The One Ring, and this is the first edition One Ring. You're probably more familiar with the Free League. Free League just created the second edition. The One Ring actually has a kind of interesting metacurrency system. His hope and hate. Bad guys get hate, good guys get hope. And what's interesting, what I like about this is, number one, hope, not only does hope give you these benefits and bonuses, but hope is also sort of a resource, kind of like luck from Call of Cthulhu, where if your hope gets too low, relative to like your shadow rating or something, your character becomes disheartened, right? Your character becomes drained. And so the idea is that, while hope is a very powerful tool for your character to succeed at things, if you spend it too recklessly, or if it doesn't come back, then, your character can become actually disheartened and become weakened and can potentially become vulnerable to the shadow. And I also love the idea that as your character is touched by the shadow, that it becomes more and more likely that they'll be disheartened. The other thing that I like about hope, and maybe it's a little diegetic, but at least in the second edition here, the way that you regain hope is through fellowship and through taking rests. And so in that respect, it's pretty, it's not super metacurrency. It's actually kind of like tied into the structure of the game. But the reason why I do like it as a metacurrency, though, is because hope is still kind of an abstract concept. It reinforces the core gameplay of the idea. It's meta because it enforces the gameplay loop that the One Ring wants you to have, which is it wants you to go on these adventures and these grueling journeys and then rest. And then it wants you to go on a grueling journey and then rest, right? Lord of the Rings is sort of defined by these perilous journeys and then a respite, and then a perilous journey and then a respite. Right. So they travel and it's brutal and it's horrible, and then they get to Rivendell. And then they travel and or they get to Bree, and then they travel and they horrible and they get to Rivendell, and then they travel and it's horrible and they go through Moria, and then they get to Lothlorien, right? And so it's this idea of a series of sort of respite. So it builds it into this game as, we need to stop and regain our hope. And I think it's very thematic and it's tied into the world of the game, but I don't think it's as good as some of these other ones here at S tier. And but it's simple and it's easy, and I think it's expressed well, and I think it creates a good play experience for the people who are playing the game. Blades in the Dark. So stress is a metacurrency, although again it could be arguably talked about as something that your character experiences in game. But the fact that you can spend stress to do some pretty out of game stuff, like flashbacks. To me, the metacurrency power of Blades in the Dark of stress is unthinkably powerful. It makes you feel like a competent thief and scoundrel, even though you, the player, are not a competent thief and strong, scoundrel, right? Hindsight is 20/20, and a lot of times, I'm not a skilled thief. So when we go and go rob someone's house, and then there's a security system, and I think, why didn't I think to disable this beforehand? Because I'm not a thief, but my scoundrel is. And I can spend stress to do a flashback and flashback to my really smart, really cool, really capable thief doing that awesome idea. It's still my idea. I just didn't have it at first because I wasn't thinking about it, because I'm not a good thief. Similarly, and I've talked about this before, but this is more of a resolution mechanic. I think that order of operations really matters. And I've always said that for me, for my money, Blades in the Dark has one of the most satisfying resolution mechanics of avoiding consequences. So when a consequence happens to your character in Blades in the Dark, the GM speaks it so, right? Your character fails a roll, and you get a bad consequence, and I tell you what that bad consequence looks like. Right? I speak it into existence. It's out there. It's hanging over everyone's head like a gray cloud, right? Your character's, leaping from rooftop to rooftop to escape a blue coat patrol. And I go, okay, well, you get to the last thing that, you'll be able to get away. But it's a perilous leap, across a busy street. It's, 5 stories down, and your character, I'm like, finally, let's make a prowl roll, or let's make a, prowl roll. And you roll shitty. And I get to make a consequence, and I will speak that consequence into existence. I say, you leap, and at as you jump forward and clear into the air, you're just not there, and you fall down several stories. You get tangled up in a couple of wires or electrical cables that kind of flip you around and spin you around, and then you land with a sickening crunch on the street below. And I'm going to say, take level 3 harm, body shattered. Okay? So in Blades of the Dark, you speak that into existence. And then the player gets to do this really empowering thing where they say, no, that doesn't happen. I'm going to spend stress and resist. And instead of that happening, my character flips over, barely grabs onto one of those wires, does a couple of flips, spins down, and, lands with a twisted ankle instead. And I'm not on the roof, I'm on the floor, I'm back on the street, but I'm also not body shattered. And depending on the tone and the style of game that you're running, you could even say your character does several backflip pirouettes, does like a gymnastics routine on a couple of different poles, or goes full Indiana Jones, right? And falls off the roof and breaks through several awnings, And I say, and you land totally fine, right? And then you land into a cart full of hay, right? You could do any of that. It depends on the tone that you're trying to state. And as a result, it can feel very empowering as a player to spend that, because that you roll badly, and this metacurrency, this stress, is letting you come in and take control of it. And it's the order of operations of stress that I really think is awesome. Ayo! Oh, we got a
Anonymous tipped $60.
all right. No message from Anonymous. $60. Somebody needs to claim that. Well, thank you very much. Looks like we're going to be going here. We're going to be doing a Sunday stream. So cheers. Do we know who Anonymous was? No message, not author. No author. Yeah, no message, no author. So that's a new one. We don't get those very often. So I can check. I can actually go and check and see if somebody, if I want to. Maybe they want to remain anonymous. I'll give them, if they want to remain anonymous. Oh, okay. Yeah, I was good. Okay, Sunhawk. I did know it was you. You had so many problems trying to send it. Well, Sunhawk, thank you so much for that. Sunhawk, because you got our $60 tip goal by yourself. Sunhawk, what do you want us to talk about on Sunday, since you have sponsored that stream, good sir? Thank you so much for that. This one's for you.
I am strong, strong, strong.
Thank you, Sunhawk. That is very, very generous of you. And yeah, think about it. Let me know what do you want. What do you want to have happen? We'll do it. So much pressure. Well, you don't have to decide yet. It's only Tuesday. And if you don't, it's fine. But you know, I'll take the thing. But you get that choice, right? Because that you took care of that all on your own, and I really appreciate you for that. So thank you so much for that. Very, very nice. Let's see here. Against the Dark Master. Okay, versus D has drive, which is gained by playing to your passions in a way that puts you or the party in danger or moves the story in a new and interesting direction. Yeah, and I think that sounds like that is going to be a solidly, probably A tier type mechanic, because I haven't had experience with Against the Dark Master yet. But, you know, I think that, again, a meta currency needs to feel good when you get it. It needs to feel like it's worth it getting it. And it should be helping the game accomplish its goal, right? And Against the Dark Master, right, it wants you, you know, to dive into your characters and put the party into dangerous positions, right? Or move the story in new and interesting directions. Those all sound like very interesting things. So yeah, I think I don't have it on my list here, but again, I don't know the mechanic exactly, but it sounds like it would solidly A or B tier. Let's see here. So that's Blades in the Dark. So Numenera has GM intrusions, and I'm not going to get too much into the detail of these. We talked about them on the Numenera stream. I don't really like the GM intrusions. I think this is one of the things that I didn't like about Numenera. I didn't like that you could spend them or keep them or spend them for XP. I don't like that you have to make that decision between getting XP and spending them. And I'm just not, and you can like pay XP instead of getting it. So it's like a fate point where it's a compel and you can buy it off with a fate point, but it's your experience points. So I just that left a bad feeling in my mouth. I don't know. I didn't really like Numenera GM intrusions. In fact, actually, I'm going to put it down to D tier. Not a big fan. Sunhawk likes Essence 20's story points, but I will say they're like B minus C plus. Yeah, so I haven't really gotten into Essence 20 yet. I haven't really. I know, Pawn No Longer, Damien has always been espousing them, but I have not really dived into the Renegade stuff. And someday I will. The problem is, like, I didn't like G.I. Joe, and I didn't like what are all the Essence 20 systems? Let's see. I did Renegade, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Power Rangers, My Little Pony. I don't know if My Little Pony is Essence 20, but these were just not my these were not my games, or my shows, going up. I didn't watch Transformers, not really. I didn't watch G.I. Joes, not really. I was a little too old for Power Rangers. So all of that kind of doesn't really get me. So that's the reason why I haven't really looked at Essence 20. Let's see here. All right, I could see a situation where a player who absolutely hates any kind of failure accumulating stress super quickly. Elia, that happened with my Scum and Villainy campaign. That happened with Smith and Tim and Kaz and George. You know, if you give people a lifeline, right? They're, you know, like one of the truisms of D&D, and this is like kind of what led to like the 15-minute adventuring day or the 5-minute adventuring day, or the you know, Cure Light Wounds wand spam, is if you know, give it a choice between being at full and not being at full, players are gonna, you know, choose to be at full hit points. And so, you know, when you have this resource, stress, and you go, I could fail here, or I could spend my stress, you're absolutely right that they will max that out really quickly. And the game will very quickly, in fact, I would even argue it's good to max out your first stress, because then you get a trauma. And then when you get your first trauma, now the XP question at the end of the session, did your trauma affect you in a negative way this session, it applies, and you can actually earn XP faster and more easily. That being said, I mean, that character who never fails is going to burn bright, burn hot, and burn out, right? The character who is just, and maybe that's a totally valid way to play. In fact, maybe that's even the most valid way to play, right? This character who just pushing themselves. The city is grinding them down. They are accumulating trauma after trauma after trauma. And then once you get your fourth trauma, your character is retired. So, or is dead. So, you know, to a certain extent, that's a acceptable way of playing, and the game will kind of self-correct. And you can have these players who, it's like, you know, all the, what are the musicians that die at 27 or whatever it is, you know, they burn brightly and then they fade away, you know, because it's like they burned hot and they burned out. So you could play your character like that. Like there's a point to be made about playing cautiously and accepting things as it comes in Blades in the Dark. But maybe that's not how your scoundrel is. Maybe they don't care, that, you know, they'd rather risk it all in the big gambles, you know? Let's see. Casey says, this happened to my players, Ayla. They got frustrated that they couldn't do anything in the downtime phase. I took 10 minutes at the start of the next session to chat about failure being okay. I'm curious why they couldn't do anything in the downtime phase. I mean, even if a character stresses out in a scene during a heist, a score, they should still be available to do stuff in the, you know, downtime. Hell, if they trauma out, they clear their stress completely. Dan says, I would like to try and lower Fate Core's ranking, as a metacurrency is too mechanical to the point of feeling detached from the fiction when you use it. Well, by definition, Dan, a metacurrency should be in some ways detached from the fiction, right? I mean, like, in a sense, the purest form of metacurrency would be completely detached from the fiction. And I argue that Fate is definitely not detached from the fiction, right? My character is going to make a huge social faux pas in this scene because my, you know, raised in a barn aspect was being compelled, right? My character comes from a background in the fiction of the game. They are, you know, an uncouth, rude, you know, kind of slack-jawed yokel. And here at this fancy party, my character is going to, you know, I don't know, you know, start double dipping or something, you know, double dipping his chips in the dip, slurping the punch right directly out of the bowl. And maybe that's what I would do anyways, but I'm doing it for the compel, for the fate point. But I feel like that's grounded right in the fiction. So Sunhawk says, I will say G.I. Joe is probably the easiest to reflavor for your own setting. After Transformer TPK, we're talking about an Overwatch game using G.I. Joe. Interesting. I don't know that much about the Overwatch IP. I've seen like a couple of like the videos, so I understand that it's supposed to be like this, you know, superhero league of cool people. So that'd be kind of cool. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure generic military RPG could probably be fairly well, reflavored from that as well. I was explicit about my players about the first trauma and Forged. It's worth getting, even if it feels like a failure. Yeah, absolutely. My takeaway from Blades in the Dark is that the best way to manage stress is to pick your battles and really think about what your character actually cares about succeeding at. And yeah, that's a great point, because Blades in the Dark and Forge in the Dark games with their meta currency really kind of, in a way, say you can spend this currency to accomplish kind of whatever you want, but you can't accomplish everything. And so, like you said, it's really about showing what your character does care about and picking and choosing your battles. Additionally, the game has this sort of tension where if your character does a desperate action, you get to mark experience points. So, the game is basically rewarding you for making a desperate action. But all these really horrible outcomes that we're talking about happen when you make a desperate action. On the other hand, I had a group of Blades characters who almost never, in fact, I don't think one of the characters did get a trauma, but the spider. But it was funny, the session, the heist that the spider got a trauma was they were paid to go outside the city walls to an old an old mansion that was outside the lightning towers and was now, inhabited by irradiated mutants from the Deathlands. And his character was way out of his depth because his character was this kind of foppish, noble, dilettante, not a, gritty wasteland survivor. And he got tore up by mutants. And that's when he got stressed out and got traumatized. But his character would almost always angle for a controlled position. He would even trade position for effect. He would take risky standard and turn it into controlled limited. And the reason is he felt it was more in line with his character, but it was also more in line with this person and his persona. Because if you fail a controlled roll, one of the options is just, you don't succeed, try a different tact, or press on, but at a slightly riskier position. So basically, if you fail in a controlled position, you don't basically take any harm. You basically are just like, you miss that opportunity, and now the situation's gotten a little bit more dangerous. So it gives you this sort of get out of jail free card. But the controlled position doesn't award you experience points like a desperate position does. And oftentimes to get a controlled position, you have to have somebody else set you up, or you have to be willing to trade effect for position and go from risky standard to controlled limited. And a lot of people don't want to do that. They just want to be like, push the metal to the metal, go, 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 go. And if they want to do that, great. Their characters are going to burn bright, but not for a long time. They spent all their actions de-stressing and getting heat down to 0, right? Yeah, okay, that's right. They spent their whole time on vices to reduce stress, because the same players who hate failure also hate seeing their stress above 0. Well, the only thing I will say about that, Casey, is number one, remember, you can always buy more downtime actions with rep and with coin. So that's one thing. So you can always get more at downtime actions with rep and coin if you really need that, time to do that. Number two, if you indulge while your stress is low, you are likely to overindulge and thus create more problems for yourself. So that should be self-correcting, but I'm not going to get into the particulars of it. Yeah, there you go. I personally have a hard time as a Blades in the Dark player risking an overindulgence. It's sometimes something I should get over, but overindulgence can really suck. Whereas I had a player who almost went out of her way to overindulge because she loved the idea that her character after the heist, she was like this, she was a leech, who made all these crazy drugs. And she was they were a drug dealing. It was basically Breaking Bad in Blades in the Dark is kind of what my last Blades in the Dark campaign was. And she was like the mastermind chemist. She was the Walter White of the group, but she was also I'm not just the president, I'm also a client. So she would just go on these crazy drug benders and just indulge with her own experimental drugs. And she just lived for just getting into trouble and causing all sorts of problems. And she just didn't give a fuck. Not only the player, but the player character was I don't give a fuck. I'm going to go and, get super high and then go to the police ball, just I don't care. Let's see here. So GM Scott says that also feels bad. And again, GM Scott, this was what happened. So that was that game with that group of players. But then when I played Scum and Villainy, with Smith and Tim and Kaz, they did struggle with that because they would burn their stress like a motherfucker. But then in order to relieve their stress, they felt like it was, they didn't want to risk overindulging and yada, yada, yada. And that might be something that you need to, tweak. Like, for example, our scum and villainy campaign was a little bit more heroic. They weren't as much scoundrels and scum. I mean, they were scum, but they weren't like evil. And so in that regard, so Smith's character, his vice was that he's on the run, right? Like he's wanted by the galactic hegemony or whatever. But he has a daughter, right? And his vice was basically calling his daughter. And the idea there was that by talking to his young daughter, that was what was curing his stress. But the risk, the overindulgence risk, was that, they could trace route to him, or that maybe the hegemony would figure out who his daughter was and put her in danger, right? And so it was less like, I'm into drugs, I'm into dangerous overindulgence. It was more tied to this idea of this, the risk of the vice, rather than like it being like a moral failing. So I completely agree with Kalana here. It's one of the mechanics that other forges refuse to let go of that doesn't fit. It is very easy for that not to fit the experience. I think the only reason that the overindulgence is there is as a punishment mechanic for people who are trying to basically heal to full. And they don't want you to heal to full, right? Because I think, number one, I think the game would be too easy. If characters were at 0 stress at the beginning of every mission, then, you just resist, reroll, devil's bargain, or push for dice, push for effect, aid, like you would just spend stress left and right, and then heal to full at the end. And I think that is not a really great gameplay loop. That gameplay loop starts to sound like? It sounds like fucking 5-minute adventuring day from D&D. And I don't think that's a good spot for anybody, Sanjeev says, I love greedily husbanding and building my pool of Burning Wheel Fate and Persona points for that one epic moment. I recently rolled 16d6 as a Burning Wheel Dwarf and got one measly success. Epic fail. And Sanjeev, I was more talking about Torchbearer. But there is definitely that option to, Torchbearer with the exploding sixes, you could theoretically roll an insane success and get some incredible high ob number. But you could also still fail, and that's what's great. So the game doesn't want you to heal to full. Light bulb. Yeah, I mean, thematically, part of the idea of these characters' lives is they're not supposed to be stress-free, right? The idea that their character, right? Another way to think of it is, if you're leaning into sort of the scum and villainy and the scoundrels in the dark, is vice is a very unhealthy, but potentially very expedient way of relieving stress. We could imagine that there is some healthy alternative to indulging your vice, right? Like spending quality time with my family, helping out with a community garden project. And maybe that heals, 1 or 2 points of stress, something really simple and wholesome and good. But the idea is that that's not what these characters do, right? These characters are living on the edge and they don't have the time or the inclination. And quite frankly, they need harder hitting shit than that. So the vices that they indulge in can be very powerful, but they can also be very damning and very dangerous. And these are not player characters in the heroic characters in the traditional sense. These are people from the gutter living in a shitty situation. And the reality for them is they are probably never going to be stress-free. I completely agree. Ayla says, if you were stress-free, you probably wouldn't be in the business of organized crime. Exactly. If you wanted to be stress-free, you'd be, running your little merchant stand, right? Or being, you know, what do I do? I work in the eel farms, you know, I till the mushroom gardens, right? This really ordinary blue collar super thing. The point is your character is like, fuck that. I'm going to take what's mine and I'm going to suck this city dry. But that comes at a cost, right? And that is that it is stressful, and the city is going to chew you out and spit you out, and you're probably going to end up traumatized and awash in vice and poverty and misery in the gutter. But there's a chance for greatness. And for some people who are in that situation, that chance is worth the risk. Yep. You guys are exactly saying it right. You're locked into a truly awful city where you need to scrap by for everything that you would earn. Yeah. So it's a question of putting people into the right mindset, you know? So GM Scott says, many of my players are the only safe plays kind of players. I could see them all trading out effect to get controlled every time. And that's okay too. Just understand that you're going to be making more rolls over time, that, eventually those controlled rolls will fail and will become risky, right? And the position can deteriorate. The GM is still able to inflict harm. And so, eventually those things do end up, costing them. But there is something to be said about playing cautiously. And if the players can justify it and they can figure out a way to be a cautious criminal, and not lose effectiveness for it, then that's totally fine and I think acceptable. That's pretty good too. Yeah, I mean, obviously there are ways that you can, cure zero stress. But yeah, I mean, I think it's it is supposed to be you can't think of it as a healing mechanic, right? You have to think of it as like I don't know. It's like healing, but with a cost, right? It is supposed to be a danger. And by and large, if your character has, 5 or 6 stress, you should probably indulge your vice. But if your character only has like 1 or 2 or 3 stress, yeah, you probably don't want to indulge your vice. Number 1, it's maybe not worth the downtime action. And number 2, there's a good chance you're going to overindulge. So, yeah. All right. Do we have anything else on here? I didn't know about Ars Magica. Somebody said it, but I didn't actually know if it had anything on there. I did want to talk about Conan, and I'm going to specifically talk about Conan as Conan 2D20. And this is the 2D20 system that Dune uses, that Star Trek Adventures uses, and Conan was, the out of print now, I think, but it also uses it. So what 2D20 uses is it uses 2 pools. The GM has a pool and the players have a pool. The player's pool is called momentum, and the GM's pool is called doom or threat in other games. And immediately you could see the DNA here that went into fear and hope, if you're familiar with Daggerheart. And the idea here is it is a economy where the GM, instead of having this infinite pool, essentially, of tokens that they can give, that they can do anything they want and give the players tokens, the GMs are limited by how much threat they have in their pool. Now, their threat can build up. The players can give the GM threat if they need to reroll dice. So the GM's pool builds and builds and builds. Now, the player's momentum pool, right? If the players are doing well, it can build momentum. And then they can use that momentum to keep the momentum going. But the momentum pool will decay over time. It's kind of a use it or lose it resource. Whereas that threat pool can just keep building and building and building. It doesn't necessarily fall out. Now, the GM can use this threat pool, right, in order to, bring in reinforcements and kind of cheat, and kind of fudge in a way. But the players understand, as a narrative pacing device, this is how much danger we're in. If the GM doesn't have any threat in front of them, then we are in a situation where things feel safer. But if we are taking a lot of actions and we are giving the GM a lot of threat and we are generating a lot of threat and the GM's pool is grown and big and big and big, now we have to understand that we're in a part of the game where things are going to be more difficult for us and we're probably going to lose, or we're probably going to suffer setbacks. This is a very heavy-handed approach. Okay. This is almost like the GM moves of PBTA, of narrative metacurrencies, because now the GM themselves, in a way, is limited by what they can do. I can't just, as you're fighting the Harkonnens in the street, there's suddenly a whirring overhead as a Harkonnen ornithopter, flies into position and a triple Gatling gun flips out and begins spraying down bullets. I can't just do that. I'm cheating. I'm bringing that into play, but I don't have any threat. I can't do that. So this puts kind of some handcuffs on the GM and says what they can and can't do. And, I know at the very beginning of the stream, Beowulf was talking about, having more hard and fast rules about how and what, how these things are awarded and restored. And I think 2D20 does that. For my personal taste, I think it's a little too heavy-handed. And I'll be completely honest with you, I didn't love the fear mechanic from Daggerheart. Because while I like narrative currencies, I don't necessarily want to be playing with the same kind of rules that the players are having. I don't necessarily want it to be this kind of weird closed economy where when the players are doing well, then they can spend and I can add threat and then I get a bunch of points. Now I can do stuff. As a GM, I kind of want to feel empowered to always be able to do stuff. I just worry about playing a 2D20 game and getting into a position where it's like, well, that's a really cool idea and I should totally do that, but I don't have any threat. And, if the players don't give me any threat, am I going to be like not able to do anything except for just read what's in the adventure, I guess? And also it puts me in a weird spot because I like to play very low prep gameplay. And if you're playing a pre-written adventure, that makes a certain amount of sense. What's in the scene? I use that. But if I'm just kind of playing it off the skin of my teeth and just kind of making it up as I go along, what's the difference between me making something up versus me bringing in reinforcements and needing to spend a threat to do that? This is something where I maybe need to spend more time with the game and more time with the rule books and the GM sections and get, some actual reps under my belt. But it did seem to me like I would struggle with that a little bit. And so I can only put it, I think I have to put it to B tier. I think it's cool. I think it works to sort of build, to build the narrative pacing. I just don't know if it does it in the most, in the way that I would like it the most. If the players have no momentum, they can give the GM threat to get some. Right, exactly. Why not allow the opposite to happen? So what? You can give the players momentum in order to generate threat. Maybe that's a possibility. I don't recall that being a possibility. I could be wrong. And each of the 2D20 games is a little different. I've only read Conan, Dune, and Star Trek, but I did think it had promise. It just might be something that would require me to sort of shift the way that I think about the games a little bit. Okay, well, it's 9:30. We talked a lot about metacurrencies. We kind of laid out some of my favorites here. So again, we've got at S tier, we've got Call of Cthulhu, the original Dungeons and Dragons. Why? Because of hit points. Why Call of Cthulhu? Because of luck points. Why Earth Dawn? Because of super diegetic karma, which theoretically should not be a metacurrency, but it really is. But it's so tied to the game because everything in Earth Dawn is tied into the setting. All the mechanics. It's actually insane. Fabula Ultima just does a chef's kiss job. 2 different resource pools that are used by the GM and by the players. Both groups feel good when they use them. The players always feel like they're being encouraged and rewarded, and it doesn't have the sort of heavy-handed, I compel you to do something stupid that some people have such a big problem about, like with Fate and Torchbearer and all the like. Fate is sort of the definitive metacurrency game. It's good, it's great, but it is a little heavy-handed, and in some ways, the game revolves around that. Mutants and Masterminds demands players play in a certain way in order to gain narrative points, narrative metacurrency. And without that narrative metacurrency, their characters kind of don't function. So you have to be a superhero or you don't get any points. Some people hate that because they hate doing stupid stuff, but it works. Torchbearer, I think is really good. However, it's kind of tricky because now you have 2 different types of metacurrencies, Fate and Persona. It could be kind of which one is which, how do I get win, how do I get the other one? And more important than that, some people think, oh, this is a game about dungeon delving. And it's really secretly not. It's a game about people and beliefs and what you fight for. The One Ring has hope and hate. Hope is really cool. It ties into the themes of Lord of the Rings, of willpower against the shadow. That hope and fellowship are what allow the men and the hobbits and the elves of the West to defeat the evil forces of Sauron. Blaze in the Dark, stress is awesome. It's GOAT. It's a fantastic meta currency, and it works really well. B tier, we've got Savage Worlds D&D 5th edition, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, Burning Wheel, and Conan. I only put Burning Wheel here because it can be confusing, even for me. But I like these. I think they're totally awesome and they're great. There's just some issues of implementation for them that I don't necessarily love. Like, for example, bennies are cool, but they don't really change the way you play the game. They're not really tied to the narrative. It's just ways for you to re-roll the dice. Morkborg and Legend of the Five Rings have a metacurrency system, but quite frankly, it feels tacked on and doesn't really feel that powerful or useful. And then I kind of actively don't like Pathfinder 2's hero point system, and I don't like Numenera's GM intrusion system because it asks players to either take an experience point or not, and I don't feel like they should be forced to have the GM intrude and then spend that either for a bonus or XP. That's a weird decision to have to make. I don't like players having to feel like they're stuck in this Faustian deal. In fact, I much prefer Fabula Ultima, where the players get the Fabula point and they can spend the Fabula point to do something cool and amazing and get a reroll or get a big bonus and succeed. And then that's how they get the experience point, right? So Fabula Ultima, you get to have your cake and eat it too. So it's, it feels real fun to play. And then just as a sort of a call out, most Powered by the Apocalypse games, particularly Apocalypse World, Dungeon World, etc., actually do not have narrative metacurrency or metacurrency at all. In fact, the games don't need them in a way because the rules and the moves are set up and the principles and agendas such that you don't need metacurrency in order to create a sort of narrative experience. So that's what we got. So we talked about narrative metacurrency for about an hour, and then we talked about these different games for about 2 hours, and hopefully you all got a good appreciation for what the differences are. And yeah. Oh, okay. We got a super chat coming in from Ms. Elia. Elia says, the power of super chat metacurrency compels you. Rank Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. Although I do prefer V20, I recognize that 5e cover. Thoughts? All right. So, Vampire the Masquerade. So, and please correct me if I am wrong. That the metacurrency of Vampire the Masquerade is willpower, if I recall correctly, right? And basically you can kind of push through and, certain, you can enhance your rolls. You can resist going into like vampiric frenzy or whatever. And then maybe you can resist being dominated or something like that. So it's pretty much tied to will, certainly, and then you can get it back through achieving, like, acting appropriate, right? So this relies fairly heavily on sort of GM Mother May I. But fundamentally, acting according to your nature. Okay, in older editions, it was acting according to your nature to recover willpower. Okay, well, in that case, I probably put it at B tier. Because, yeah, I think that, you have this sort of, number one, it's a little diegetic, right? We can understand this idea of willpower as a resource. Obviously, in real life, it's not quite so simple, the same way a fuel tank is. But, there's this idea of I have a very strong will. I have a very weak will. And when someone has a strong will, they can accomplish great things, right? They can get the difficult stuff done. But they could also resist the beast, and they can resist, being dominated. So there's a certain amount of diegeticness, right? That kind of ties into that. And willpower feels like something we can understand. Now, how do we recover willpower? Well, obviously acting in accordance with your nature is a way to reward players for playing the way that their character should be played. Is that something that we feel like would benefit the game? Yeah, it's a mechanical incentive to play your character's nature, even if doing so isn't always to your advantage. Now, that doesn't seem like there's a disadvantage to not playing to your will, to your nature. And so from that end, you know, it feels like it's something you can do, but you're not forced to do. Now, that makes it not as strong of an influencer, but it is an influencer. And I'll be completely honest with you. I like metacurrencies that are kind of punishing. I like metacurrencies like Torchbearer, or Fabula that kind of demand that you get them, that you need them in order to sort of, you know, succeed. My issue, if I have one, with these type of systems is, sure, the character has to act within their nature in order to regain willpower. But what if they don't want willpower? Or what if their willpower is filled up? Then they can just act however they want and not really be incentivized or punished in any capacity. And so that's one of those ones where it's a little bit weaker to me, but I appreciate that it's fairly diegetic. Willpower is something I think we can wrap our mind around, and it probably would lead to interesting outcomes, which is a good thing. So I would probably say B tier. All right, Karama. I'm just going to fill up the rest of this meter here so we can go to war with Immortals. The other team can't die. Must have hero points or something. There we go, Karama. All right, cool. So we're going to do a War of the Immortals stream. Mostly I want to talk about Mythic, points, or Mythic rules. I was a big fan of Mythic Adventures from Pathfinder 1st Edition, and I have been sort of eagerly awaiting these for a while. I've had some theories and we've had some guesses. In fact, if you played in earlier Northern Reaches seasons, then you already had Mythic Proficiency, because we already had Mythic Proficiency plus 10 in Northern Reaches Season 2, which was a year ago. But I am interested to see how they did it and the way that they did it. And if it's a narrative currency that actually enforces anything or not, and if the powers are cool. So it's kind of a nice spin-off from this stream. So appreciate it, Karama. And we'll do that stream. Thank you. Does Root technically have metacurrency? Sort of. You have the resource tracks, but we understand that they are pretty diegetic, right? Exhaustion, injury, depletion. I mean, it's abstract, right? It's abstract, but it is kind of a metacurrency, because when you roll a move, you can spend exhaustion to not suffer the ill effects if you're using your skills. So that can kind of feel like a metacurrency, but the exhaustion is recovered through, and also particularly the way that you can clear those tracks. Like if you follow your character's drive, I think it clears your exhaustion. So that has roots. It's very in between. It's weird. It's weird because you can also cure your exhaustion and depletion. Like you can clear your depletion by getting more stuff and, accumulating new little bits and doodads and going and, stealing a bunch of stuff or harvesting stuff in the woods. So it's tied to the fiction, but it does feel like a meta currency. So it's weird. It's weird. In a way, yes, the PBTA moves are sort of your meta currency. That is an interesting way of thinking about it. Yes. Grim missed the whole stream. Sorry, Grim. Yeah, it definitely feels more diegetic to spend your willpower, and specifically for those unique things. Like you're not going to be spending willpower, I'm guessing, to create a narrative truth. It's more tied to we can imagine like a Dragon Ball Z moment where the character's like, no, I'm going to use all my will to accomplish this. Now, I've never really, I don't know if I've ever really experienced that in my real life, but maybe I've just led a very charmed and easy life where I've been like, I'm failing, but I need to succeed. And maybe that works, maybe like, physical things, like when I was racing, when I used to run and race, but like anything else, it doesn't feel like that would really apply, at least for me. Can an RPG work without any metacurrency at all? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of games out there that, don't really have much metacurrencies at all. I mean, I was being a bit flippant by calling hit points a metacurrency. And they are to a certain extent, but when they're pretty low, it's really not much of a metacurrency. I'll say that. A lot of the old school games are pretty low or no metacurrency. A lot of like the grindy, grim simulationist games, the GURPS, the Roll Masters, those are no metacurrency games. So from that end, you know, it's it is the case. I think there's a distinction to be made though between games that are just a totally normal game, and you know, it's a totally normal game, and then they just kind of randomly throw on this like random, and sometimes you get to make a reroll, right? That's D&D, that's Pathfinder. It's a lot of, you know, some games, and to a certain extent that's Benny's. Those games are really weird for me because I'm just like, I get these rerolls. Why? They don't really mean anything. They don't really affect my behavior. The only thing they do is they sort of make sure that I can't fail. So then why am I rolling dice? Like pick a lane, you know? Whereas there are metacurrencies, which actually influence the way that you play the game and the way that the story evolves and the way that the characters evolve. So I am much more prone, if I'm going to have a metacurrency, I would prefer it to be a narrative metacurrency that not only shapes the choices my characters make, but also, you know, fundamentally makes the role playing of my character the game that we're actually playing, right? And so XP in a way is a metacurrency. The difference though, Dan, is typically metacurrencies are earned through behaviors in the game, but one could argue that XP is earned depending on the way that you play the game as well. So yeah, XP is a metacurrency. Yeah. Unless, you know, we have this kind of vague notion over, I would say this, XP is a metacurrency sort of made more sense to me actually back in the day when you got XP for treasure, because now people are like, oh, you get XP, you know, for accomplishing your goals and achieving things. And it's like, yeah, I guess you would gain experience and get better at your, you know, your stuff by going out there and doing stuff. Whereas with treasure, it totally just felt like a gamist construct, because it's like, why am I leveling up? Because I got a bunch of treasure? It's because that's what the game's about, you know? But yeah, I think it's fine. Yeah. Can a game not have metacurrencies? Dread, yeah, can't have metacharacters if you don't have a character sheet. Dread does not have a character sheet, really, and not really. Actually, it does not, and it does not have metacurrencies. In Dread, you pull the block, and if it falls, you die, and if it doesn't, you succeed. I will never agree that. So here's the thing: milestones are just a way of doing XP in a way that is usually obfuscated and lowers player agency, right? So he took the bait. Yeah. So I mean, milestones are just experience. It's just the same thing as awarding experience points. You're just deciding what you award experience points. The difference is a lot of GMs just do that, but then they do that arbitrarily, and they don't let the players make the decisions about how and when and where and why they're going to get rewarded. They just arbitrarily say, and here's your experience. Now people say, well, I don't give experience. I just let them level up. Okay. So you just gave them 1,000 experience points, or you just gave them 10,000 experience points, whatever. It's still experience points. You're just changing the nature of it. You're taking it out of the player's hands and putting it into your arbitrary hands. And I just dislike that. I just think that it's better when the players know what they need to do in order to achieve goals, and have a plan of attack to do so. In Pendragon, you gain glory XP for spending treasure. I appreciate that. I want to run a game where characters can level up whenever they choose to. I want to try that. Well, Derek, no, I just said that characters can choose to go get experience points, or they can choose not to. And what I award experience points for is me saying, this is what I think is important in the game. And then it's up to my players to choose how to interact with that interface. Now, to contrast this, consider Legend of the Five Rings. Legend of the Five Rings does not use experience points for, you know, accomplishing goals, but it does not use milestone either. In Legend of the Five Rings, you get 1 experience point for every hour that you play. So it doesn't matter what you do in the session. You could spend your entire session, right, at a tea house talking about the upcoming war, role playing, everybody's in character, maybe not even that many dice rolls. You do that for 5 hours, everybody earns 5 XP. Or you could have a session where it starts off with the bandits attacking, and the players have to, you know, fight for their lives. And then they arrive at the village and they discover that, you know, a neighboring daimyo has employed a Ronin army and is going to come in and conquer this land, and the samurai are left to defend against, they militarize the peasants, they stir them to action, they build crude fortifications, they train the peasants to fight, and then when the Ronin come, the players, samurais, heroically fight them off in another mass battle, and their epic victory, and they played for 5 hours, so they get 5 experience points. So Legend of the Five Rings is telling you something very different. Legend of the Five Rings says, game is not about doing stuff. And that is a different way of playing a game entirely. In a sense, Legend of the Five Rings says, this is just a game about being engrossed in this samurai world. And we're going to reward you as long as you're doing that, aka playing. That's fine. Fundamentally, that's, the only difference is it becomes more railroady in that way, right? Like you could say, look, I'm going to tell you what you need to do. Okay. You need to get to the end of this adventure. Okay. And get the MacGuffin. And when you do that, you'll level up. And so the players are like, so we can go do whatever we want and we can accomplish great things. But that's not worth anything unless we go and do the thing that you prescribed. So, and then if you start saying, well, no, I have milestone experience for a bunch of different things. It's like, okay, so then at that point, you're just putting all the XP in one spot. You're just saying, well, that's worth 1,000 and that's worth 1,000 and that's worth 1,000. And at that point, I don't know, what are we even doing here? Basically. So anyway, all right, folks, I'm going to wrap it up. It's 10 o'clock. I don't know what we're doing Thursday. Obviously we'll be back Sunday because we're going to do a super stream. Sunhawk gets to decide if they have a couple days to decide. But Thursday is Halloween. A lot of people are busy and, parents are going to be busy with kids and all this other stuff. I don't know if we're going to do anything. Plus, a lot of people are like, do a horror stream. Remember, I'm terrible at horror. The only time we did a horror stream on this channel, well, 2 times. One was a horror stream, and I had Vin and Ben on, who are both much better at that, Ben the Bastard, to talk about horror in RPGs. And the other time we did Dungeons in the Dark in Dread, in the Dark or something. Dungeons and Dread in the Dark. And it got turned into a comedy of errors because, Smith brought a 3rd edition character to the Dread game, and Vin was a Wild West gunslinger from another world or something that got transported and stuck in Ravenloft. It was a crazy session. So those are my 2 horror streams that I've done. Kyle, I could probably get bored and sign on anyways. I am familiar with Bluebeard's Bride, Dan. So, nice little one shot. All right. I don't know. We'll see how we're feeling. We'll see what's going on with the patrons. I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. 2 stream goals. That's a rarity these days. We don't get quite as many people. We've been covering some pretty obscure topics, but I appreciate all of you hanging around and sticking around for these topics, and leave comments. Let me know, what are the type of things that you want to see. Remember, this is the YouTube channel that can and will talk about damn near almost everything because I have Patreons, I have tips, I am supported through other ways. So, we can talk about Metacurrency tier ratings, and we can talk about Chubo's marvelous wish granting engine. And I don't have to worry about views, and I don't have to worry about, not covering enough 5e or stuff. So be a patron, support channel. Let me know what you want to see. And if you're, if you're a loyal viewer, I'd love to hear from you as well. Because again, we don't get a lot of views, but I like to think that we're reaching the right people. Did you miss it? You sure did, Steven. You missed the whole enchilada. All right, folks, that is going to do it for me tonight. Hopefully I'll see y'all Sunday for sure. Maybe I'll see you Thursday. Otherwise, I'll see you next time on Knights of Last Call. Good night, everybody.